For 18-year-old Marina Bolter of Bloomfield, Indiana, New Year's Eve of 2014 was much like any other. It was a night of excitement and revelry among those nearest and dearest to her. It was also a night when the adults of her family might just be too socially lubricated to notice or care if she happened to be indulging in a little tipple herself. So as the afternoon drew to a close, Marina, who had a part-time job working as a grocery store clerk at the IGA grocery store, boisterously clocked out of her shift and began the journey home to get ready for the New Year's party that she had been planning on going to. Needless to say, she was excited to blow off some steam. You see, 2014 had not been an easy year for Marina. During the summer of 2013, Marina had discovered she was pregnant, and after the birth of her child in April of 2014, Marina had to do some growing up, and fast. She got herself the grocery store job, trying to put her wild child days behind her, and committed herself to being a responsible, loving mother. But God laughs at well-laid plans, and tragedy was about to befall her. In August of 2014, a violent argument erupted at the family home between her older sister and her boyfriend. The argument quickly became physical, one in which household items were thrown around the home, and in a horrendous stroke of misfortune, Marina's baby was injured in the melee. Neighbors happened to catch wind of the injury to the infant and swiftly reported the incident to Child Protective Services. A social worker was dispatched to the home, who, with a heavy heart, made the decision to remove the child from the home and place them into foster care. Marina was devastated and vowed to do everything she could to win back her child. But it was not to be, for yet more tragedy was to strike Marina and her family, because that New Year's Eve, after she clocked out of work, she would never arrive home. In fact, as people would come to learn, it was as if though she had simply dropped off the face of the earth. One of the first places we might wish to look in order to get answers as to what happened to her is her relationship with a young man by the name of DJ Lockhart. Marina had a rather tempestuous, on-again, off-again love affair with DJ, who was the father of Marina's child. They were young, foolish, and headed in two very different directions in life, but as Marina's mother insisted in the years after her disappearance, they were very much in love. Despite what many have said about DJ possibly being responsible for Marina's disappearance, there are just as many who are, or were, close to the Bolter and Lockhart families that insisted that DJ was only guilty of loving her too much, given that he was devastated beyond belief at her having vanished on New Year's Eve. Yet there is another man in Marina's life who we must consider as a possible suspect, or who at least may have had a hand in facilitating her disappearance. In late 2014, Marina and DJ were not seeing eye to eye at all, and to all outside observers, it seemed they had definitely broken up. This was mainly because Marina seemed to be seeing other people, mainly an older man named Toby, who she seemed to be rather secretive over. But she was being secretive about him for good reason. You see, not only was this older man married, but he was actually an old friend of the Bolter family, one that had known Marina's parents ever since she was born. Toby acted as something of a sugar daddy towards Marina, helping her out financially until she was able to afford the rent on her own apartment. However, it's important to note that Marina having her own place was one of the stipulations for regaining custody of her own child. It appears that Toby was less of a serious relationship option and more of a means to an end. But as much as Marina tried to keep the relationship a secret, in a small town like Bloomfield, it's only a matter of time before even the deepest secrets see the light of day. And in the process, Toby's wife, who was also an old friend of the Bolter family, discovered her husband's infidelities. And shockingly, it was actually Marina's own mother who informed her of it. So as it turns out, the New Year's Eve party that Marina was supposedly headed to that night was none other than Toby's. But as she strolled out of work, calling Toby on her cell phone to confirm a few last-minute arrangements, she spotted someone walking towards her across the store's parking lot. According to Toby, Marina's last words to him before she hung up the phone were, "Uh-oh, it's DJ." Marina did not call Toby back. In that surprise parking lot encounter, DJ straight up told Marina that he knew where she was planning on going for New Year's Eve, adding that he didn't approve of her relationship with Toby whatsoever. He then pleaded with her to attend a New Year's party with him instead, insisting they should work on repairing their relationship for the sake of their child. Marina replied that it was not the time or place to be having such a discussion, that she had made plans with Toby and she was sticking to them. DJ was furious, but supposedly took the rejection on the chin before offering to give her a ride home so she might get out of the cold. But it seems that Marina actually managed to get a ride home from a regular customer. Whether or not she did this out of pure happenstance or begged to be taken home because she was afraid of DJ is entirely up for speculation. But one thing is abundantly clear. The following day, Marina failed to show up for her scheduled New Year's Day shift at the IGA store. Knowing full well that she would head out to a party after work, Marina's employers were initially unsurprised by her unauthorized absence. There had probably been some drinking involved, and with drinking comes hangovers, and with hangovers comes tardiness. But still, they tried her cell phone to see if she was going to be heading into work at some point, yet there was no answer. IGA management then got in touch with Marina's mom, hoping she might be able to provide some answers on her daughter's whereabouts. But Marina's mom hadn't seen her either, and the news that she had failed to show up for work only succeeded in worrying her. She headed over to Marina's apartment, using her spare key to let herself in. There were no signs of any break-ins or struggles, but Marina's purse, cell phone, and keys were all missing, along with her work uniform. This meant that, in all likelihood, she never made it home from work that evening. Marina's mom immediately reported her missing, and a police investigation began shortly afterward. Obviously, given the fact that she seemed to have disappeared immediately after leaving work, police stated very publicly that they wished to speak to the customer who had apparently driven her home that evening. It took 3 whole weeks for the man to come forward, but we can understand why he might be nervous. In an interview with investigating police, the man claimed to have dropped her off at a pizza place near to her home. The restaurant was closed, but Marina apparently openly stated that she didn't want the man to know where she lived. Although this might seem like an unusual thing to say, when it was put to Marina's mom, she attested that it was just the kind of thing her daughter would say, and that to her, it was a totally believable story. This was backed up when the man was made to undergo a polygraph test and passed with flying colors. Despite being one of the main suspects in Marina's disappearance, DJ did all he could to help the family find her, even if it was to no avail. He was said to be absolutely bereft about her disappearance and was never quite the same afterward. Marina's mother spoke highly of the young woman and always insisted that he couldn't have been involved in her vanishing. However, Marina's father and his extended family have perennially viewed the boy with suspicion, openly stating that he had the most to gain from her having disappeared. But the fact remains that we will never truly know if he was responsible, as we will never get a full confession. You see, DJ took to drinking heavily after Marina went missing, getting into more and more trouble with the law and the local populace, so much so that he got into a violent altercation on February 12, 2015, one which ended in him being stabbed to death by the man he had gotten in a fight with. And then there's Toby, Marina's old lover who had given her thousands of dollars to try to help her get her life together. He was one of the last people Marina spoke with on the evening of her disappearance, and one might think that he would cooperate fully with the investigation into her whereabouts. But by all accounts, Toby acted very suspiciously in the months that followed. He apparently stopped talking to Marina's mother altogether, and only involved himself with Marina's father, almost aggressively asserting that DJ was to blame for her disappearance. However, there is another person of interest in this case who we can simply not ignore as a suspect, a man by the name of Vernon Gale Briner. Vernon was a convicted murderer who had been previously sent to prison for the murder of a 19-year-old girl and had only been released from the penitentiary in 2012. As it turns out, Vernon had a solid alibi for his whereabouts at the time, with an employer testifying that he was at work at the time. Vernon also passed a polygraph test in which he was straight up asked if he had done anything to Marina, with the results indicating that he was telling the truth when he said he had nothing to do with her going missing. To this day, there have been no significant clues as to what happened to Marina Bolter. No dead bodies had ever been found that could have matched up to her DNA or description. No one outside of her small hometown has ever seen anything matching her description either. For all intents and purposes, it is as if she just vanished from the face of the earth. It's a terrifying prospect that, even in the digital age, with man's ability to track and trace using the plethora of electronic devices we employ in our daily lives, that a girl as well known and well loved as Marina could simply disappear, never to be seen again. There were many suspects in her case, many people who could have snatched her up and disposed of her in a way that no one would ever find her. But only one man is guilty. Only one person really knows what happened to her, and how her final moments on this earth played out. And to our knowledge, that man is still walking the streets of the United States, knowing he committed perhaps the worst crime imaginable, and knowing that no one can touch him for it. The Melbourne suburb of Pakenham is one of the wealthiest areas in all of Australia. The area is home to several large mansions that house some of Melbourne's most successful business people, boasting sprawling estates with luxury amenities such as swimming pools, boating lakes, and even small-scale golf courses. It's one of these mansions that 45-year-old Michael Griffey called home. He lived with estranged wife Diane, along with children that Michael hardly saw due to his busy work schedule. He would often spend long periods of time living in an apartment he owned in Melbourne itself, using it as a kind of base of operations for his many business ventures, including the parent company D&M Plaster Transport. On December 31st of 2004, Diane and the children were hosting a huge party to celebrate the coming of the new year. Scores of guests swarmed around the grounds of their stunning estate, eating canapes, drinking champagne, and looking back over a year that had brought many of them great financial success. But Michael himself was nowhere to be found. When asked, Diane replied that he was home, but that she had not seen him, and was probably milling around somewhere in a drunken haze, socializing with business associates or eyeing up the young cocktail waitresses that floated around with silver trays laden with luxury food and drink. But the reality was something far more disturbing, because although Michael was indeed on the property, just not in the state his loved ones imagined him to be. Because on the evening of January 2nd, 2005, his wife Diane, along with their 17-year-old daughter Cassandra, walked into one of the second-floor office spaces to find Michael lying dead in a pool of his own blood. The mansion was vast, with so many rooms that Michael was found to have been dead for days, simply lying in a room that none of the family had been in for quite some time. The investigating coroner determined through tissue analysis that Michael had been bludgeoned to death at around 3 p.m. on December 29th. Whoever had murdered him had then wrapped his bloodied corpse in a striped bedsheet before attempting to hide it under a tarp. There were 3 large and seemingly fatal wounds on his head, and one obvious defensive injury to his wrist, indicating that he had attempted to fight off his attacker before being overpowered and killed with a blunt object. Police discovered that Michael's wallet and cell phone had been stolen from the property, and that $1,000 Australian had been removed from a safe that only 3 people, one of which was Michael, had the combination to. They also found that 2 pages had been torn from a journal that his family said had a meticulous record of his movements and business dealings. Given that Diane was the beneficiary of both of Michael's life insurance policies, which were valued at almost $2 million, she was one of the first people to be considered as a suspect. Police discovered that not only had she written bad checks in the time before he was killed, but that in the short time before his death, Michael had complained to his friends that his wife was mishandling money, and that he could use this fact to gain the upper hand when it came to dividing up the family finances in the event of a divorce. It was also discovered that Michael was having multiple affairs and financially supporting other women, and that the main reason he was staying in central Melbourne so much was not because of business dealings, but because it afforded him time to indulge in his extramarital affairs, However, he had not done a very good job of keeping this a secret from Diane, and text message exchanges made this very evident indeed. However, Diane's lawyer prevented her from commenting on how this made her feel, and this, along with the other evidence of her financial misdealing, made her the #1 suspect in her husband's murder. She was arrested in 2007, and preliminary hearings began shortly after. Yet the case was not to be a simple one by any stretch of the imagination. Not only was there simply not enough evidence to really charge Diana with Michael's murder, but a number of other twists and turns in the case meant that pinning down a definitive suspect became almost impossible. Bizarrely, during the preliminary hearings of the case against Diane, her and Michael's daughter, Cassandra, the very same one who had found his body on that fateful day in January of 2005, actually attempted to confess to his murder. Despite her insistence that it was she that beat her father bloody in the days after Christmas before attempting to hide his body with a sheet, police noticed a series of inconsistencies in her story and dismissed it as a false attempt to implicate herself in something she had nothing to do with. But the question would cast a shadow on the entire affair for the duration of the investigation. Just why exactly would Cassandra want police to believe that she was the murderer? Police also investigated Michael's son, Kenny, who was something of a playboy, living a fast lifestyle with fast cars and even faster women. There was every reason to believe that he too needed money, but again there was very little evidence to suggest that he had even had it in him to plot the murder of his own father, let alone go through with it. Police managed to secure an interview with one of Michael's mistresses, a woman by the name of Jillian Gold, who had apparently been engaged in an affair with Michael for the better part of 5 years. She knew that she was not the only woman whom Michael had been seeing, but since he had essentially funded her lifestyle and was not written to his will, there was absolutely no reason to believe that she was the one who had killed him. However, there was a chance that since Michael was known to partake in sugar daddy-style relationships, that breaking it off with one of his so-called sugar babies had resulted in an argument that may have resulted in a kind of revenge killing. But since Jillian was completely ignorant of these other women's identities, she couldn't point police in their direction, and the investigation into being an affair-related murder floundered. Police then got in touch with Katrina Fitzpatrick, Michael's sister, who told the police of a rather worrying encounter she shared with her brother in the time before her brother's death. Around a month before he was found dead, Michael got in touch with Katrina in an attempt to arrange a meetup with her. She had dithered over a time and place, citing her busy work schedule, but Michael had almost violently insisted that they meet as soon as possible. They met in a high-end cafe in downtown Melbourne, and from the get-go, Katrina noticed that Michael appeared to be acting extremely shadily. She had apparently tried to confront him on the reason for his off behavior several times, but was rebuffed on each occasion, with Michael insisting on reminiscing about happier times, including their childhood together. By the end of the conversation, Katrina, admitting to be extremely worried for her brother's mental state, and pressed him for one final time about the reason for their meeting. Michael barely said another word, instead opting to present her with an expensive piece of jewelry, beginning to cry as he told her he loved her. Michael then departed the meeting, and Katrina never saw him alive again. There happens to be another interesting aspect to this case, albeit one we might struggle to fit into the bigger picture. In the year 2008, almost 4 years after Michael's murder, it was discovered that his plaster transport company was facing dire financial difficulties in the run-up to his killing. Michael owed over $1 million in taxes to the Australian government, as well as owing $100,000 in loans to other creditors. A lot of this loan money could be accounted for, but some of it could not, and it's possible that Michael owed money to some people that it might be extremely dangerous to owe money to, the kind of people that, if it appeared that the debt might not be repaid, might simply have Michael killed as a warning to others. So the question remains, just who killed Michael Griffey, and what exactly were their motives? There was no doubt that Michael seemed to know he was in danger. The teary encounter with his sister is a testament to that. There's also the possibility that he believed or knew that he wasn't safe in his own home, which is why he stayed so often in the downtown Melbourne apartment. The fact that he seems to have been murdered in his own home is all the evidence we require to back this theory up. There's every chance that Michael was murdered as a result of his debts, but the fact that his daughter tried to confess to his murder throws a huge wrench into the works of such a theory. She was obviously trying to cover for him, but whether or not she was trying to cover for her mother or her brother is another question entirely. I think we can all agree that this is frankly terrifying, that someone's own family might well be involved in their murder, and that those that are supposed to love and cherish us are just as capable of snuffing out our lives in the name of greed or malice. Whether or not answers will finally come out regarding his death is anyone's guess, but for the time being, Michael's death will remain yet another unsolved mystery, and his killer is free to walk the streets.
No, this happened just last night, and I'm still a little shaken up over it. I'll try to retell the story exactly as it happened, but the occurrence may have fogged my memory a bit. My name is Jason. I'm a 17-year-old male, and I work second shift at a local Walmart in a small central city. At about 10 p.m. after my work period was over, I was driving home when I decided to stop for gas. In retrospect, it was really stupid to stop at all. The gas station was poorly lit and it was completely vacant of other customers, but I knew the shady areas of my town, and this was not usually one of them. I pulled up to the pump, expecting nothing less than just a quick in and out visit to the station, and began fueling my car. I waited for about a minute or so until I heard that prompting click of the gas nozzle. Just as I closed my fuel cap, I grabbed my receipt and began making my way to my driver's side door. An unsettling looking woman pulled up right beside me, regardless of all the other surrounding pumps that she could have gone to. I didn't think too much of it though, given that I was just leaving anyway, and just continued on to open my car door. But then I hear her shout something. "Hey boy, come here," while then motioning me over with her bony, tattered fingers. Me being the friendly person that I am, decided to engage in conversation with her, despite my immense feeling of uneasiness. I conferred back, then sang, "Yes, miss? How can I help you?" I now realized that I should have put more consideration into my words, as she then said, "Yeah, I need you to come over here and pump my gas for me," which I thought to be a bit odd considering she looked perfectly capable and she didn't even give me a reason as to why she couldn't do it herself. But stupidly, I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. I started walking over to her vehicle when I then picked up on a bit of a red flag. She had already turned her car off as if it was ready to be filled up, except that her tank lid wasn't on that side of the car. Once again, I just gave her the benefit of the doubt and then thought, well, maybe she just forgot which side it was on, and continued round to the pump nearing her car, and then I saw it. The second big red flag, just on the other side of her car, was a light that I could vaguely see through her window, hence illuminating everything within the back seat of the car. Even through the densely tinted window of her sliding van door, I could vaguely see the silhouette of at least two grown men staring right at me. When she noticed I had saw them, her entire demeanor completely changed. Her face looked cold as snow, and then turned into an angry, frustrated look. And that was it for me. There were too many bells that were going off in my head telling me to get the hell out of there. Just as I began to back up towards my car, she started screaming at me, demanding me to come back. I then bolted to my driver's side door, which was luckily left unlocked, turned on my engine, and then threw it into drive. I booked the hell out of that gas station without a second thought. Luckily, they didn't appear to follow me as I got onto the more far-populated interstate. It also didn't occur to me to contact the police at the time since I was so in shock. I just really hope they didn't find another victim because of me not informing the proper authorities about it. It's a really scary world out there, so if you ever have an uneasy feeling in your gut like that, trust it. To both those creepy men and that woman, I just pray and hope I never see you guys again.
Back during summer breaks when I was a kid, I was pretty much glued to my mom during the daytime. Everywhere she went, I went too, as I guess she just didn't trust me to stay home alone. I can't blame her. I was definitely a little menace when my age was still in single digits. But actually, maybe she should have left me home alone, because taking me everywhere with her resulted in the single scariest moment of my childhood. So, one day, we head out on a grocery run real early in the morning, and since I was still half asleep, I pretty much refused to get out of the car. Since she was only planning on being a couple of minutes at the most, she agreed, then scurried off into the store as I closed my eyes and decided to take a nap. Oh, an important point, I climbed into the back seat to do this, then cuddled up under the blanket that my mom kept back there. Keep this in mind for what comes next. The next thing I know, I hear the car door opening again, so I open my eyes thinking, wow, that was fast. And that's when I see that the person who just sat down in the driver's seat is not my mom. It's some dude with a shaven head, and I still remember all the scabs on the back of his head as he started doing something under the dash, something which I now know was hot wiring or whatever you want to call it. I remember being so scared that all I could do was watch, thinking, I don't know you. What in God's name are you doing in my mom's car? I didn't expect him to start it because even though I was incredibly young, I knew that he had to have those special keys to make the car move. But then out of nowhere, the engine starts, after which the guy shuts the door, starts driving my mom's car out of the parking lot. Only then did I start to scream, because it hit me that I might never actually see my mom again. This random guy wasn't just stealing my mom's car, he was stealing me too. The moment the screams left my mouth, the guy slammed on the brakes so hard that it almost threw me off the back seats. He spins around, and I'll never forget how this guy had actual facial tattoos. These are scary enough to see on another adult, but since I was only like a kid at the time, I just figured this dude was a straight-up demon. He looks at me and then just screams, "Get out of the car, kid!" I didn't even have to be told twice. Even though I was still in my PJs, I practically jumped out of the car, still bawling, and just ran towards the grocery store as the car drove off. I can only imagine how horrible it must have been for my mom to have her kid come sprinting into the store in floods of tears, screaming, "Mom, Mom, someone just tried to take me away," then having to piece together all the info to realize that she almost lost her only son. These days, I totally take blame for the whole thing. I shouldn't have been such a lazy little brat, and the whole thing would just be a non-event to me. It'd be the day our car vanished, not the day I almost accidentally got kidnapped. I always tell my mom not to feel guilty about it, as basically all is well that ends well, right? But still, the whole thing definitely tops the list of my most frightening childhood memories.
On Christmas Eve of 2015, I was partying on the rooftop of a high-rise building in New York City. There was a small, I guess you could call it platform area, where chairs and tables had been set up, and all around the rails someone had hung up red and green Christmas lights. There was about 6 of us on the platform drinking and smoking, and taking in the view of the city. But with the wind, it was just too cold to stay out there for long. I was just visiting the city with friends, and once I had my fill of the cold, I went back inside and mingled with the people who worked in the office. After another 45 minutes or so, I went back outside to have a cigarette, and found myself alone on the platform. I walked to the edge and leaned out over the side, the wind nearly ripping the cigarette out from between my fingers. I turned around and put my elbows on the railing, and looked up at the building behind me. It had one of those tall spires with a flashing red light on the top to alert low-flying planes. As I looked at it, I paused, and my cigarette fell from my lips. Something was on the spire. Something alive. Distracted before by the wind and the faint sounds of traffic below, I hadn't heard the sound of something hard tapping against metal. The red glow of the tower light flashed on and off, and I could faintly make out something wrapped around like a snake moving down the spire, and the shine of light reflecting off its body as the scarlet hue illuminated it for a few seconds at a time. I stood stunned, and slowly went for my phone to take a video. My body was moving slowly, as if instinct was telling me any sudden movements would be a mistake. I dug through the pockets in my purse blindly, looking for my phone, not taking my eyes off the thing. It was definitely moving, sliding down the pole like a single droplet of water moving down an icicle. I remember thinking, should I be screaming? As soon as my hand found my cell phone, the thing spread two massive bat-like wings. For context, there was a standard-sized American flag hanging vertically on the landing just beneath the spire, where I presumed maintenance people would stand. Each wing was easily twice the size of the flag. I dropped my purse and phone and sprinted back inside the office, catching my foot and falling flat on my face upon the carpet. I felt a whoosh of cold air behind me that hit me hard like a wave on the beach. I started wailing and choking on my own breath, and was convinced at any moment I would hear alarms and would see spotlights combing the city. I mean, I couldn't have been the only one to have seen it. This was New York City, one of the most densely populated areas in the country. I screamed for someone to call the cops and started frantically changing the channels on the TV, convinced that Anderson Cooper or somebody was going to make a breaking announcement about some creature flying through the skies above New York, but there was nothing. A dozen people tried to calm me down, and I sobbed and told them that there had been something outside, something that had wings. I went into the bathroom and vomited, not because I was worried about the creature, but because everything else happening around me seemed so normal, and no one was reacting. Someone ended up calling an ambulance for me, and the attendants checked me out in the hallway, but I was fine. I wasn't even close to being drunk. I made quite a scene at that party, and I have not been invited back. They call me the Dragon Chick, and no one believes my story. My therapist told me that I should write all this down to reflect upon it, and try to make sense of it. This is the 5th time I have, and nothing is becoming any clearer. Please, someone out there, tell me you've seen it too. I need to know that I'm not crazy.
In January of 1992, Kelly Day Wilson was just a 17-year-old senior at Gilmer High School. With her well-coiffed curly blonde hair and extravagant jewelry choices and bright blue eyes, Kelly Day was a pretty picture, and had no problem making friends after she relocated from Natchitoches, Louisiana to Gilmer, Texas, so she could live with her mother and stepfather. She hit the ground running and struck up an on-again, off-again relationship with a young man by the name of Chris Denton, and the two spent a great deal of time together in the lead-up to the new year. It seems Kelly's life was going swimmingly well, and it's clear that no one could have possibly expected what fate had in store for her, something that would raise questions among true crime enthusiasts that pervade even today. On January 5th, 1992, Kelly finished her shift at the Gilmer Square outlet of Northeast Texas Video, closing the store at around 8:30 p.m. before heading over to a local bank to deposit the store's daily takings. This particular bank branch's security cameras showed that an individual did indeed make the night deposit for that evening, but the captured footage didn't provide a clear enough image of the person for a positive identification of Kelly, simply showing an arm in her car. We can presume it was her, but we can't be 100% certain. After locking down the store's shutters with their manager, Joe, he wished Kelly good night before driving away in his truck. The last he ever saw of her, she was last seen wearing cut-off stonewashed jeans, a purple rugby shirt with gold trim, and brown loafers, and was getting into her car in preparation for her night drive to the bank. But Kelly didn't arrive home that night, nor did she check in with any of her friends. Her mother became so worried that she sent her stepfather out into the night to aid in the police search that ensued. And like grim providence, it was him that found Kelly's abandoned car in the Northeast Texas Video parking lot at around 5 a.m. The car was sporting a single slash tire, and all of Kelly's personal belongings, including her purse, were inside of her car. Only she and her keys were missing. At first glance, what happened appeared to be a complete mystery, but it was one that local law enforcement was determined to get to the bottom of. For 2 years, the investigation into Kelly's disappearance was headed up by a Sergeant James Brown. One of the first people investigated was obviously Joe, her manager, and the last person to see her alive. However, not only did Joe have multiple alibis, he passed several lie detector tests issued by the police, and as a result, he was rolled out as a suspect. Sergeant Brown oversaw a team consisting of hundreds of police officers and local volunteers, one of which poured thousands of man-hours into an intensive search of the surrounding area. Yet despite such a thorough search, as well as hundreds of tips from the general public, not a single trace of Kelly was ever found. Police believe that they were close when they arrested 17-year-old Michael Griffey, who was taken into custody on misdemeanor charges in an incident of alleged tire slashing. Michael was guilty of many, many things, but as police discovered, slashing Kelly's tires wasn't one of them, and in the end, he too was ruled as a suspect in Kelly's disappearance. Investigators then turned their gaze to another suspect, Kelly's on and off again boyfriend, Chris Denton. The couple were said to have been going through a rough patch at the time of her disappearance, and with people saying that Chris had something of a short temper, there was a period where he became the case's prime suspect. However, through the course of the investigation, circumstantial evidence would clear him of all wrongdoing, and the police would be forced to look elsewhere for their abductor. Unbelievably, in a number of interviews conducted in the process of their investigation, police had heard a handful of stories alluding to a satanic cult that called Gilmer home. But since the accusations named members of law enforcement as members of the cult, specifically Sergeant James Brown himself, the claims weren't taken seriously by those that heard them. Yet in 1994, the local community was rocked by almost 50 indictments against 10 different people, all on charges of child abuse. And given some of the evidence presented against them, police proceeded with charges of aggravated assault, aggravated kidnapping, and capital murder in connection with Kelly Day Wilson's disappearance. It's at this point that Kelly's story seems to intersect with that of the Kerr family, because in 1990, a man named Wendell Kerr told his wife, Loretta, that he wanted a divorce, kicking off a chain of events that would bring prosecutors their one best chance at finding the perpetrator. Wendell Kerr was one of 6 adult children of Eugene and Geneva Kerr, a couple who were briefly married in the 1950s before a hastily divorce. Geneva Kerr went on to marry 2 other men, both of whom died before Geneva remarried Eugene, making him both her first and her 4th husband. According to their children, Eugene and Geneva Kerr abused their children on a daily basis. A relative later confirmed their claims of carnal abuse and spoke of witnessing daily incidents of indecent assault. This same relative also confirmed that they'd witnessed Geneva Kerr's interest in satanic practices, including daily readings from the Satanic Bible and an interest in both animal and human sacrifices. In exchange for law enforcement's help escaping the Kerr family, one of their grown-up son's wives offered to tell investigators everything. She claimed she was kept as a slave to the family for 10 years, couldn't drive a car, constantly threatened by Geneva and Danny, and her only form of identification, her birth certificate, was kept by Danny in his wallet. In her own horrifying words, her role was simply as a breeder. Cut back to Wendell asking his wife for a divorce. Loretta strongly began to suspect that Wendell was trying to ditch her for a younger woman, and if that was the case, she was going to burn his entire life down before she left. She went to the police with accusations, and as a result, Wendell was arrested, placed on the offenders register, and forced to serve out a period of probation. A state welfare worker assigned to the case later concluded that ritualistic, satanic abuse was endemic in all branches of the Kerr family, and over the next several years, almost a dozen of the clan's children were taken into the care of Child Protective Services. The social worker also mentioned in a horrifying affidavit that in October of 1992, 2 of the children took us to show us where the devil meet people to abuse and hurt babies. In 1994, the escaped Kerr wife was interviewed by the Harrison County Jail in Marshall, Texas, in which she described in gruesome detail the torture that Kelly Wilson would receive for approximately 9 days before she was ritually sacrificed and then cannibalized. She described Geneva as the leader and said that several of the Kerr clan, along with Sergeant James Brown, were all present during these events. Connie Martin and Wanda Kerr both had stated in interviews that Kelly Wilson was a birthday present for Geneva Kerr, and that the matriarch reveled in the poor girl's torment. Yet in light of the accusations, it came to light that information was allegedly coerced from the Kerr children, as well as some of those indicted in the disappearance. Some of the children were allegedly programmed to tell the stories the investigators wanted, while the prosecution tried to coerce a confession by offering life in prison in opposition to the death penalty as long as they confessed to the killing, best summarized in the quote from a state official that reads, "Investigators working on little more than hearsay have created a mythology about a satanic cult, leading to what some describe as a modern witch hunt. They indicted a whole family and even a police investigator, destroying his law enforcement career, straining his marriage and prompting death threats. The Texas Attorney General, finding no evidence any of the charges were true, instead uncovered suggestions that the whole cult theory was the product of coercion by overzealous investigators, even to the point that they physically restrained children to elicit allegations of satanic activity." Ultimately, the Attorney General's office were forced to dismiss every single one of the charges alleging satanic abuse and sacrificial murder. The satanic cult was found to be a complete fabrication, nothing more than a fantasy concocted by the Kerr children under the influence of police investigators. Chris Denton, Kelly's old boyfriend, tragically died of cancer in 2004, but there were rumors that he had made a deathbed confession. But close family dismissed these allegations as thoughtless, malicious hearsay and maintain Chris's innocence to this day. Joe Henry, the owner and manager of the Northeast Texas Video and the last person to see Kelly before she vanished, stayed mostly under the radar for a number of years. But in a despicable twist in the story, Joe was arrested on charges of possessing indecent images of children. However, police have emphasized that in spite of the nature of the charges against him, he had never been considered a serious suspect in Kelly's case. For all the twists and turns, trials and confessions, finger-pointing, and numerous suspects, Kelly Wilson has never been found, despite 20 years of searching. She is presumed dead, but a body has never been found and no valid charges have ever been made in connection with the case. Around 9:30 p.m. on the night of August 29, 2002, 31-year-old Audrey Herron called home to excitedly announce that she'd gotten a raise. Her husband Jeff congratulated her on the good news, before Audrey told him she'd soon be finishing her nursing shift at the Columbia Green Long-Term Health Care Facility in Catskill, New York, where Audrey worked part-time. It was fantastic news for the couple, as the extra income would make providing for their 2 children considerably easier. An hour and a half later, at around 11 p.m., Audrey said goodnight to her fellow nurses, headed out into the parking lot to her 1994 Jeep Grand Cherokee, then began the drive back home. She made the same commute to and from work every single day, driving back and forth along State Route 23 in the Jefferson Heights area of Catskill, and that night was no different. One coworker claims that Audrey drove behind her for a few minutes after leaving the office. Given that the weather that night was rainy and foggy, it wasn't long before she lost track of Audrey on the dark, rain-slick roads. The drive from the nursing facility to Audrey's home in Freehold, New York, is about 12 to 15 miles, so 20 minutes driving time at the very most. Audrey's husband expected her home at around 11:25, and he usually stayed up to greet her as she came through the door. But that night, Audrey didn't show. It wasn't entirely unusual for Audrey to have her shift extended at short notice, either to cover another nurse or because a patient required urgent care. So initially, Jeff didn't bat an eyelid at his wife's absence. He didn't even bother to call the hospital to make sure she was actually still there. He just went to bed at his usual time, completely unconcerned. Jeff later recounted that he woke up at around 2 a.m., the morning of August 30th, and noticed that Audrey was still not home. But again, due to the erratic nature of the job, he simply went back to bed assuming that there had been some kind of emergency. The following morning, Jeff awoke at around 6 a.m. to find that Audrey still hadn't returned home. He called the hospital, but was told that she'd left at 11 the previous night. He then called Audrey's mom, Shirley, and asked if she had stayed over at her place. Shirley had only just returned from a Florida vacation with Audrey's daughter from her first marriage, and naturally her mother was excited to be reunited with her, so it seemed only logical that Audrey had driven to her mother's that night. Only she hadn't. Shirley said that not only was Audrey not there, but she hadn't heard from her daughter at all since arriving back in New York State. Only then did it become evident that something was wrong, both Jeff and Shirley become increasingly concerned for Audrey's safety. At 10 a.m., an increasingly desperate Jeff got in touch with Audrey's stepmother, an ex-police officer, who helped him file a missing persons report. However, she also advised him to call around Audrey's friends to check if any of them had seen her. The first 48 hours are crucial in any missing persons investigation, and with any luck, Jeff might be able to locate her before anything untoward occurred. One of Audrey's friends, Karina, recalls getting a voicemail from Jeff at around 1 p.m. that day saying, "Hi Karina, it's Jeff Herron. We're having trouble locating Audrey. If you've heard from her, please call me. Thank you." Karina has since stated that the first thing that struck her about the voicemail was Jeff's unusual tone. For a man whose wife had been missing for more than 12 hours by that point, Karina claims he sounded remarkably indifferent. You'd expect him to be panicking and anxious, she said, but he just sounded all low and sad, almost resigned. It was only a day into the search and he sounded like he'd given up. Karina had been very vocal that Jeff did not sound concerned in this voicemail, just sad. Karina had wondered why Jeff didn't contact her earlier in the morning before Audrey was reported missing, as she was one of Audrey's best friends, and Audrey had stayed the night with her before. She also wondered why Jeff sounded low-toned and sad on the voicemail instead of panicked and concerned, considering it was less than a day into not being able to locate Audrey. Karina also noted that Jeff could be rather controlling sometimes, and that Audrey had talked of him checking up on her frequently if she went anywhere without him. So, according to her, the fact that he was content to remain in the dark regarding her whereabouts for almost 7 hours is extremely suspicious. On the evening of the day she was reported missing, Audrey's friends got together to walk the route she would have driven home that night, keeping their eyes peeled for any sign of her or her Jeep. Her friends theorized that because it was raining that night, Audrey had taken an alternate route due to the poor weather. But since they knew exactly which short road she would have turned down, they figured that they would find her and her car right away. But not a single sign of Audrey was found along the entire route, almost as if she and her vehicle had simply vanished into thin air. Law enforcement initially speculated that there had simply been some kind of automobile accident, given that Audrey seemed to have disappeared while driving. Officers were told to keep a sharp eye out for a black Grand Cherokee while they conducted a foot search covering a 12-mile radius. Their search penetrated deep into the woods, covering every home, road, and body of water that Audrey's Jeep could have possibly ended up. Even a helicopter was called in at one point to aid in the search. But not a single shred of evidence could be located, something that mystified officers after such an intensive and rigorous search. Although relatively rare in 2002, Audrey had a car phone installed in her Jeep. But then police officers tried pinging the phone's location, and they soon found that the phone had either been disconnected, deliberately switched off, or that it had died. The cops also discovered that Audrey's purse had been left at home, implying she'd forgotten to take it to work with her on the day of her disappearance. This too struck her friends as unusual. Her life was in that purse, and even if she'd forgotten it, she would have probably turned around to retrieve it. It made them suspect that she actually had gotten home that night, and that something had occurred after her arrival at home that has caused her disappearance. Investigators were able to pull only one security camera tape from the area where Audrey was last seen. We only had one grainy video from Cumberland Farms in which it appears that Audrey's vehicle does leave her place of employment and basically turns left, going west on Country Route 23B. That's the last of any kind of technological evidence we had, one senior investigator later reported. We can't confirm it's the vehicle, but it appears to be, because the quality of the video was very poor and very grainy, and it does appear to leave at the time that she would have ended work. In the years since Audrey's disappearance, the police have investigated well over 1,000 leads, but not a single one of them has ever led to an arrest or court conviction. There are a couple of persons of interest, but no direct link to her disappearance, stated investigating detectives. At this point, clearly we suspect foul play. It's clearly a very frustrating case for us because there are no solid leads to follow. In 1998, Audrey and Jeff had had their first child together, a bright-eyed baby girl named Katie, but within a year, rumors flew that Audrey was planning on leaving Jeff, taking Kitty with her. Yet many have testified that Jeff did not treat Sanzia very well at all, who was Audrey's daughter from her first marriage. They claimed he had a habit of yelling at Sanzia, although the girl later explained that although Jeff was harsh with her at times, she described herself as a bratty child and felt that Jeff was a good stepfather overall. Jeff and Audrey, shortly after the latter, discovered that she was pregnant with her second child, Quinn, whom she gave birth to in 2000. Soon after this, the couple moved to Freehold, New York, and began building the house of their dreams on a golf course that Jeff's father owned. Life seemed serene for the couple after that, but when Audrey vanished, neither Jeff nor his family actively searched for her outside of a few phone calls, and they didn't appear too emotionally shook up about it either. Jeff claimed he was perfectly cooperative during the investigation and contributed financially to a private search effort, but these claims are contradicted by several news outlets who argue that not only did he ignore them, but that his monetary donations to Audrey's friend's PI fund were pitiful. They claim that for a man that came from a very wealthy background, his donation of just $1,000 spoke volumes about his family's attitude towards his wife's disappearance. Although Jeff claims his reluctance to mount a serious campaign of public appeals was motivated by his desire to protect his children from the macabre maelstrom of rumors and accusations regarding the death of their mother. A few months after the media circus surrounding Audrey's disappearance had died down, representatives of the Montel Williams show reached out to Jeff to book an appearance. Characteristically, he declined, but Aubrey's circle of close friends jumped at the offer of re-exposing her case to the public. After all, anything that might produce new leads or clues was worth the effort, and they harshly resented Jeff for turning his back on such an opportunity. Then in 2017, Crime Watch Daily attempted to arrange an interview with him at his home. Again, he declined, but the wall of silence had been so prevailing by that point that Jeff's father agreed to participate. In a segment that aired later that year, he told Crime Watch that he firmly believed that his son had no involvement in his wife's disappearance, and that it would have been easy for someone to dispose of the Jeep to erase any evidence of a potential crime. During the same segment, a police investigator revealed that Jeff had partially completed a lie detector test during the initial investigation, but that his father had essentially pulled him out of it under the advice of his attorney. Some have viewed this as highly suspicious, but considering how inaccurate the test can be, and how a faulty reading could be used to gain a false conviction, Jeff's father could well have been right to stop the test. In the light of the fact that Jeff had permitted full police searches of his home on 3 separate occasions, it looks less and less likely that he's anything resembling the guilty party. Audrey's daughter from her first marriage, Sanzia, who's not related by blood, has actually been very defensive of Jeff over the years, and is a staunch believer in his innocence. She publicly stated that some of the media portrayals of her stepfather amounted to nothing but hit pieces of hack journalism that tried to sensationalize something deeply personal to her, and for all the wrong reasons. At first glance, there appears to have been no financial motivation for Jeff to disappear his wife. He came from a wealthy golf course-owning family, she had no life insurance, and she didn't have much in the way of savings either. But as you're about to hear, we can't rule out greed as a motivation for her murder. Jeff's father only partly owned the golf course that had made him rich. The other owner is a Russian national, one believed to be involved in serious organized crime, who also lived on the golf course not too far from Jeff and Audrey. Apparently, when police asked Jeff about the possibility of this mysterious Russian being involved in his wife's murder, he mentioned something curious. Audrey had mentioned walking in on an argument between the silent Russian partner, Ron, and a number of other men, who were exchanging harsh words and hushed voices. The men grew silent as soon as they detected her presence, and Audrey left feeling very intimidated. It's also been theorized that the golf course was nothing but a front for the Russian mafia, who in turn leached funds from the business until Jeff's father was in their pocket. If this was the case, Audrey's disappearance could have been meant as a warning to him of what would happen if he didn't pay up. Yet whether the murder was intentional, or Audrey died in the process of being taken, is entirely up for debate, as police have never deemed the theory worthy of investigation. In 2016, a tip came from a woman whose mother had worked at the very same healthcare facility as Audrey. She claimed that her brother had caught sight of Audrey on a handful of occasions while ferrying his mother to and from the hospice, and had developed a dangerous obsession with her. This man had a long history of indecent assault and attempted kidnapping, and he became one of the prime suspects in Audrey's disappearance. New York State Police ended up draining a pond near the man's Catskill home, while corpse-sniffing dogs scoured the nearby countryside. But like countless searches that had taken place before, not a single shred of evidence was found. However, both Shirley and Sonja believe this obsessive individual is to blame, and purport that he could have been hiding in her Jeep before Audrey got in to leave work that day, and because the back doors on her Jeep apparently did not lock, it's then that her abductor struck. Audrey was recorded on CCTV, departing her workplace with no unusual indicators, but what happened after she left the parking lot is anyone's guess. In light of such a theory, it's safe to say the police have ruled out the possibility of a car accident and are focusing on the sole possibility of foul play. They've also ruled out the possibility that Audrey simply ran away, given her promotion at work and how much she loved her job. She was also a devoted mother and led an active social life, suggesting that if she did run away, that she'd have informed a friend or taken her kids along with her. Over the years, many tips have come in from all over New York and neighboring states from people claiming to have spotted Audrey alive and well, but as you can imagine, nothing has ever come of any of them. What's frustrating about this case is that the number one suspect is essentially incapable of committing the crime. In order to successfully evade detection, Audrey's killer would have had the resources and time to dispose of a huge automobile and essentially disappear it from the face of the earth. This would have been nigh impossible for one single person to do, unless they had some kind of subterranean body shop at their disposal. But this would suggest a network of motivated, twisted individuals dedicated on abducting and disappearing those unfortunate enough to be caught on the roads at night. And if that really is a possibility, a rational way to explain this disappearance, then maybe none of us are as safe as we'd like to believe. We're supposed to feel safe in our vehicles, machines built with safety belts, airbags, and roll cages, but Audrey's disappearance shows that we're just as vulnerable as our forebears while on dark country roads. And just like back then, predators stalk the highways in search of fresh meat. I feel like I should preface this by making it clear that I'm not one of these paranormal-obsessed, ghost-hunting loons that think there's orbs in all their photos. And when I tell you that one of my favorite TV shows is Penn and Teller's BS, where they debunk all those nonsense conspiracy theories and whatnot, I think you get an idea of what kind of person I am. And for years, I went around thinking that science and logic could account for everything, with the only restrictions being the limits of our own knowledge. That was until something happened to me that I genuinely can't explain, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't come up with any legitimate explanation. The whole thing freaked me out so much that it kicked off a kind of hyperfixation in me that lasted for months on end, to the point that my rational skeptic friends started to think that I was losing my mind. But I haven't lost my mind. It actually happened. And as much as people try to tell me that it was nothing but my mind playing tricks on me, I know what I saw, and it just about put the fear of God into me. We're going back to early spring of 2017 here, the time of the year when it's still getting dark fairly early here in the Northeast. It's around 9 p.m. and I'm driving back to Narragansett from my buddy's place in Newport, when I decide to take a shortcut through Saunderston. It's a drive I'd done like 100 times by that point. I felt like I could do it with my eyes closed at a push. But maybe that's what made me so complacent, a self-assured cockiness that's gotten me into trouble on more than one occasion, because about halfway into the journey, I must have switched off and taken a wrong turn. Next thing I know, I'm having to turn into a residential cul-de-sac to make a complete 180, and I'm so embarrassingly lost that I find myself reaching for my phone to check Google Maps. I check my position, mentally make a note of the turns I have to make to get back onto the highway, then start turning off the street as I put my phone away, when bam, there's a car in front of me. I slam on the brakes, let out a string of curse words, and prepare myself for, at the very best, a few scolding honks of their horn. I then start mouthing apologies at the driver, taking my hands off the wheel and being like, "Dude, I'm so sorry. My fault. My bad." When I noticed something really unusual about the car they're driving. It was a legit classic car. And don't go thinking 70s Camaro or something. This thing was a Buick, like one from the 30s or 40s or something. The kind of car you'd expect to see Al Capone climbing out of in Prohibition-era Chicago. And it was crisp, too. The guy must have sunk some serious cash into that thing because pretty much everything looked brand new. I suddenly realized that while I'm checking this guy's old car out, I'm actually still blocking him in. So I start backing up after giving him a nice car kind of thumbs up after pointing to his hood. The guy doesn't react though, at all. The whole time he's just smiling at me through his windshield. And as I start backing up to let him pass, I remember how he almost looked like one of those old ventriloquist dummies. Something about his hair or how waxy and pale he seemed to just trigger the association. Then, right as I'm about to give him enough space, my car just shuts off. The engine, the battery, everything. I jiggle the keys around, kind of frantically by that point because I figured I'm making a total idiot of myself in front of the dude with the cool vintage car, but nothing happens. Lights won't turn on, engine won't fire. My first thought is, God, of all the times for my battery to die, why now? My car was a piece of garbage back then, making it disappointing but not a total surprise. But I'm still blocking in Buick guy, who's surely getting mightily angry after sitting there for a solid few minutes. So I roll my window down, lean out a little, and start yelling over to the guy's car that he has to go around. But he doesn't respond. And all I can hear is this creepy old music coming from his car. I can't see a thing of him because of high headlights. He's not saying a thing, and the freaking song is making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Now this is the part that really freaks me out to recall. As the situation with the guy is turning into something of a standoff, I'm sitting there in the driver's seat wondering why the guy isn't talking, moving, or doing much of anything for that matter. I don't want to honk at the guy. Everything had basically been amicable so far, so I'm just sort of sitting there, waiting, getting more and more anxious as I do so. That's when the lights on my dash start flickering a little, and I think my battery might be coming back on. I don't know much about cars, but I'll take it. So I get all excited thinking I'm going to be getting away from what had been an incredibly awkward situation. I start jiggling my keys in the ignition again, but again, nothing happens. Right until my car radio bursts into life and starts playing the exact same creepy song as the one playing in the other car. It didn't have any lyrics. It was this creepy tritone loop with something playing over it. But somehow it managed to fill me with this feeling of dread as I realized something seriously weird was going on. The whole time I'm basically being blinded by the Buick's headlights while it just sits there. Then suddenly, the thing's headlights cut out, right at the same time my radio does, and I'm plunged into darkness again with my natural night vision having been totally ruined for a few seconds. While I'm half blinded, I try the ignition once again, and I breathe a huge sigh of relief when my car comes back to life again. But that little moment was severely short-lived because, as my own headlights turn on, the old Buick is nowhere to be seen. It came as such a shock that I actually screamed out loud, spinning around in my seat like I might catch a glimpse of it driving away. But no, there's absolutely no sign of that Buick anywhere. It was like it had just straight up vanished into thin air. You think with a big old engine like that, I'd have heard it driving past me even if I was distracted by other things. And the time between the headlights cutting out and me getting my car running again couldn't be anything over 30 seconds. It would have had to zoom past me to disappear from my view so quickly. Have you ever felt super stoned and you don't even smoke? That's what it felt like. I'm putting the entire thing on myself, trying to explain it away as like a mini stroke or something, and it even occurred to me that my buddy back in Newport might have dosed me with something groovy, so to speak. But no, sober as a judge the whole time. And you can bet I didn't drink anything because those Rhode Island state troopers just love hunting DUIs. So like I said, because I couldn't find any way to explain what happened, it kicked off something of a hyperfixation in me. I revisited the cul-de-sac where it happened, looked up potential classic car owners in the Narragansett area, and researched medical papers on blackouts and time loss. The latter had me convinced that I was suffering from syncopal attacks, basically when your heart doesn't pump enough oxygen to the brain, a pretty serious condition, so, as you can imagine, I was only too willing to pony up for a medical checkup. Doctor listens to my heartbeat and checks my blood pressure, then, without any further examination, declares there's nothing wrong with my heart. He did say that the blackouts can be caused by stress, but at the time, I wasn't particularly stressed about anything, so I ruled that out as an explanation. One point, I went far out and ended up researching those UFO encounters where people experience time loss, but I figured I'd gone far too down a weird rabbit hole with that one. But as for the thing that people really pick up on with my story for some reason, is the fact that I did actually have a bit of luck when it came to my classic car search. There was a guy out in Middleton who had been trying to sell a 1937 Buick Special for years. The thing was a wreck, but he figured it might catch the eye of some vintage car enthusiasts who'd find the time to fix the old beauty up. I played it off like I was interested in making a purchase and still feel guilty about how excited he got, and he got his nephew to text me over some pictures of the old thing so I could take a good look at it. I'm not saying it was the same model or shape as the one I saw in that cul-de-sac, but I'm not gonna lie, it looked pretty similar. But it's an absolute impossibility that it's the same car, right? A coincidence, if ever there was one. Yet some of the people I talk to about this will always point out the connection and tell me I should have asked where he'd gotten it, if the old thing had been involved in a murder or a hit and run. Truth is, the guy didn't know. He said his dad picked it up at a police auction and died before he could get a chance to fix it up. And obviously, anything he knew about the car was buried with him. I suppose I've rambled on enough about this now, and I've already made my point that I can't explain what happened to me that night without sounding like a complete fruitcake. So, I guess I'll just do what I always do, and leave it up to you guys to decide what it was. But please, don't tell me ghost car or whatever, because I've been hearing that nonsense for like 4 years now, and I'm sick to death of hearing it. And besides, hypothetically, I did believe in ghosts. I think it would mess me up pretty bad to think that I got so close to one, but still drove away, unscathed.
We moved to Connecticut the summer before I entered 6th grade in 2001. We moved into a beautiful new house in one of the most beautiful towns I'd ever seen. It was a bit more rural than we were used to in New Jersey, but it was an adjustment. My sister is 2 years younger than me, and she was going into 4th grade at the time. We came from a neighborhood where we were all super close and everyone knew one another. Block parties every summer and kids running back and forth to one another's houses, and we were sad to leave it. Within the first few weeks, we met some of our neighbors. Everyone was what we soon defined as very Connecticut. It was all a bit surface, and nobody had that New Jersey warmth that we had been used to. In particular, our neighbors directly across the street seemed a bit odd. The mom would come over to vent to my mom about her sons and husband, and my mom was a sweetheart and was very welcoming and warm. The holidays came around and the neighbor boy across the street was in my sister's 4th grade class. My sister came back slightly alarmed with what had happened in class that day. The students were asked to make a Thanksgiving turkey out of a traced drawing of their hands. On each finger, they were supposed to write things that they were thankful for. The neighbor boy wrote things like, being a loser, hating myself, etc. Very, very dark things for a 4th grader. Fast forward to Christmas, and my mom hears that they have nowhere to go for the holidays, so she politely invites the mother and 2 of her sons to our annual Christmas Eve party. The boys were so strange. They listened to Japanese techno with headphones on and didn't speak to anyone. They headed straight to our basement to play video games. It was weird. The younger one, though, was always much stranger than the older one, and the neighbor mom would always open up to my mom and aunt about how he would hurt himself, and how he needed to be put in special needs programs, but that he could never quite be diagnosed. They thought that he was on the spectrum at first, but that quickly proved to not be the case. We always assumed that she'd been confiding in them because my aunt was experienced with special needs kids and that she was looking for advice from her. The Christmas Eve stands out to me because they were at our home in a very intimate setting, but we saw them on a daily basis. My sister and I would come home from school telling my mom about how weird the younger neighbor boy was, and that something was just really off about him. I will never forget her telling us just to be nice to him and that we don't know what he's capable of. That struck me as so odd at the time, but we listened. I don't know if his mother told my mom something that scared her and made her say that, or if she just had a gut instinct. Recently after that, and I can't quite remember if this was in middle school or high school, I think I was in 9th grade, and my sister and young neighbor boy were in 7th, so we all rode the bus together. What my mom then said stuck out in my mind, so today I decided to be friendlier than usual. There was snow on the ground and the younger neighbor boy was drawing something in the snow and muttering to himself. I decided to greet him. "Hey Adam, what's going on? Nice morning today, huh?" He made no eye contact. "I'll bomb you," he said, still making no eye contact. We let it slide. We came home and told my mom. She reiterated, "Just be nice. We have no idea what this kid's capable of." Keep in mind, we were kids. We didn't know what to take seriously and what not to. I wished we had done more. Keep in mind, he wasn't someone who was bullied or made fun of. He was always off in the sense that he could not hold eye contact or hold a conversation or even a hello. Kids didn't make fun of him. He was a loner, but it seemed to be by choice. I never knew why we were cautious or afraid around him other than the fact that he showed zero warmth and zero humanity. We knew he had special needs, so we never really second-guessed anything and just tried to be polite as possible. When the bus would drop us off at all of our respective houses, he would run all the way up his driveway on the hill with his hands by his sides, and then would turn around and make this weird hiss noise at everyone, making claws with his hands. It was always so odd, but again, we were kids and there's always a couple of kids in school who are a little strange. We took it as just that. They were invited to several Christmas Eve parties, so memories kind of blend here. One year, the neighbor mom started screaming at my innocent grandmother for being a Yankees fan as she was a Red Sox fan. It was beyond strange because my grandma is the cutest little lady of all time and was in no way trying to argue over sports. It was though as the woman clearly had a weird switch go off. She was always nice to me, but I'll be honest, we always rolled our eyes every single time my mom invited them over. It was always such forced conversations with her. And as a teenager, I wanted nothing to do with being cornered into another chat. I think she must have just been lonely. The following and final year they were invited to Christmas Eve was when she got into it with my mom about having guns in the house. The boys only attended the first couple of Christmas Eves, so it was just the mom this time around. The topic of guns came up. The neighbor mom started telling my mom about how she has guns in the house and how she takes her younger son to the shooting range all the time. My mom said that she didn't agree with having guns in the house. She wasn't trying to argue, but the neighbor mom got out of hand about it, very defensive and ultimately getting aggressive about how she grew up in New Hampshire and that's just the way of life out there. The neighbor mom told us about how brilliant that her younger son was, and that he hacked into some of the government's highest levels of security and that the CIA showed up on his doorstep. We have absolutely no idea if this story is true or not, but this is what she told us. So it became our ongoing joke when anything strange happened at our house. There were a few odd things that happened throughout the years. Our internet had clearly been messed with, lights would flicker in the house, and we would joke that it was the younger boy each time. It wasn't until December 14th, 2012, that we knew just what he was capable of. I was out of college working outside of Philadelphia, my sister still a student in college, and my youngest brother a student at the high school. It was the worst day of all of our lives. My dad heard the gunshots in the morning that killed the neighbor mom,
Nancy Lanza. He assumed it had been a hunter in the area, maybe a little closer than usual. That is until the FBI showed up and had to evacuate the house as snipers had lined our driveway. My mom was at the mall and we were all frantically calling one another as the news slowly broke throughout the day. At first they had his identity all wrong and said it was his brother, but we knew it had to have been him. Thank God for my mom making sure we were as nice as possible, although I don't know that it would have stopped him. I wish we had done more at the time. I wish we knew to do more at the time. We didn't. We didn't want to assume the worst out of someone, but I wish we had. Approximately 20 students and 6 teachers were killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School that day. The worst act of evil I have ever experienced so directly in my life, and I hope I will never experience again. I'm very thankful that we survived growing up across the street from him, but I'm so gutted for those who didn't get so lucky. These were kids, little kids, in a place that should have been the safest haven for them in their youth. I hate it so much. I know I will never see him again, but regardless, Adam Lanza, you sick and twisted individual. I pray and hope to God that we never see you again.
I used to work at a 24-hour McDonald's during my first year of college, right in the town where I grew up. I was 18 at the time, and I'm still a petite girl. Our store owners were greedy scumbags, so for our large city, we were the only McD's staying open for Christmas, so I switched around on the schedule that I'd come in after family stuff on Christmas Eve, and be home in the morning to open presents and then sleep. Somewhere around midnight, a mid-20s man came in. He was slightly overweight, tall. His clothes kind of fit in an awkward way that's hard to describe, like he wore the same things every day and put zero thought into his appearance. The way his shirt was tucked in, the way his belt bunched his pants, that his pants were a bit too short and showed too much ankle. His beard was patchy and uneven and grew down his neck, and you might wonder why I have such a thorough description of him, because he stayed in the dining room for at least 2 hours within sight of the counter, and almost every time I checked he was staring at me. He would come back to the counter at least twice or more to order additional small items off the value menu. After the second time I caught him staring again, and he gave me a creepy smile while he still had food in his mouth. I'm bad at hiding my facial expressions, and I'm sure I wrinkled up in a disgusting face and turned away to go to the back. I told the one guy on our skeleton crew that night that some lingering dude was creeping me out and asked him to switch with me on the front. It was a pretty dead night, so it really didn't matter where we were stationed, so he switched with me. After a bit in the back, it was normally the time that night shift would clean the customer areas for a jump on the next day before morning rush started. My coworker said the dude was still out there, so I asked to clean the bathrooms instead, while he wiped down the tables, and then we'd tackle the floor together so it was quick. I started in the men's bathroom since the only guy in the place was currently at his table. But just to be sure, of course, I knocked on the door first, then called out to anyone inside that it was time for cleaning. It's not a glamorous job to clean a bathroom, but it had been a quiet night, so it wasn't that bad. Then I did the same knock to check to start cleaning the women's bathroom. It was a bit of a maneuver both times to bring in the mop bucket and the tote with the cleaning supplies, so I was a bit distracted when I came in and went to place the tote on the sink counter, which is probably why I didn't notice the shadow in the stall closet to the sink. I was pulling items out of the tote right away when I kind of noticed movement in the mirror behind me and looked up to see Creepy Guy almost fully behind me, only seconds before his hand closed on my arm. He was grinning in a way that made me feel sick right away. He pulled my upper arm in a way that made me turn around towards him, and he must have seen my face screw up as I took a deep breath because he started to try and cover my mouth with his other hand, saying something like, "Don't. No, it's okay. I think you're pretty." Not sure exactly what he was saying because I was already screaming at the top of my lungs and turning my mouth and body away from him as much as I could. With my free arm, I started whacking him with the first thing my fingers touched, which happened to be a bottle of glass cleaner. It seemed like it only took seconds for my male coworker to burst in the door. He took one look at the man in the bathroom and started screaming at him too, telling me he can't be in there, calling him a sicko, trash, scumbag, among other more colorful words. The creeper dashed for the door, trying to squeeze by my coworker who stayed with me down the short hallway, continuing to yell at him, and kept it up till creeper was all the way out the door, and a minute later, a car sped out of the parking lot. We called the cops. Statements were taken, managers contacted. I went home early and quit soon after, as I was always scared he'd show up again, or try to grab me on my way to my car, or even follow me home. So, Christmas McCreep, let's not meet again.
So for context, I'm a 22-year-old male, and I live in a large city in the Midwest. Now, I drive for Lyft while putting myself through trade school. I also drive for other similar companies, but that's besides the point. I have many horror stories from those as well, but I'll tell those another time. It was Christmas Eve 2020. I was out driving for Lyft for a few hours before heading to my mom's with my new baby and wife. Nothing really special going on for the night, just the usual. I get a ride request. It happened to be a pickup from this kinda lower income apartment complex. No big deal. I arrive, find my passenger, and he has all of his belongings with him, like several boxes of stuff. Now, my car is a 2006 Chevy Impala, so it's not really too big. We get all of his stuff loaded up, barely, and we're on our way. Now, during the ride, the guy was crying and saying that his girlfriend was cheating on him, and he had apparently walked in on them earlier that night. He couldn't stay there because her name was on the lease, so I was taking him to a hotel. Now in my city, we happen to have a street that is pretty well known for having vices. Hookers, drugs, gangs, weapons, and shady motels. You know, the works. We get to the motel and he asked me to wait for him to check in and get his key. No problem, man, I say. I'll confess, I break the rules a little when it comes to Lyft. I have a gun hidden in a concealed holster, secured to the underside of my driver's seat for protection. Reason being, driving Lyft and other contract apps, I've had knives and guns pulled on me, as well as having people trying to fight me, rob me, and all kinds of other things. But like I said, stories for another time. This motel was on that street that I had mentioned before. Homeless people were everywhere. There was a dude on the far corner of the complex that still had a needle in his arm, passed right out against the building. And I'm a pretty big fan of true crime and horror narration, so I'm on edge. He gets his key. The whole motel is ground level, so to help the guy out, I drive to his door. As I mentioned before, he had a lot of stuff, so I started to help him unload his stuff. While on my second trip getting stuff, I saw a guy come out of a room just south of my car, then followed by two ladies. They came up to the room I was next to. One of the ladies then pounded on the door, then opened it. That's when I then saw the guy raise a fucking shotgun right out of his long coat and then storm into the room. The two ladies followed him, then slamming the door behind them. Following, I heard a lot of yelling and shouting. I was honestly just waiting for shots to ring out. Out of nowhere, my passenger came up behind me. "I can take this, man. Go ahead and take off. Have a Merry Christmas." And he gave me a cash tip. I didn't even notice that he took the boxes out of my hands or slid a $5 bill in my pocket. I was frozen. I knew what may have been going down in that room. I had to leave, or at least go to where I could get my gun. I know that the guy and the ladies both saw me, and I know that they knew I saw the gun. I just had to get the fuck out of there. You know how it goes. No witnesses. I got in my car and then sped away as quickly as possible. I got a block or so away and then called the cops. I gave them every detail I could. After I got off the phone with the police, I signed out a Lyft. I hadn't made much money, but I was done. I got a call later that night. The cops investigated. They never found the gunmen or the women. They never answered the door that I saw them come out of. and the occupants of the room they went into said nothing happened and that I was full of shit. Well, I definitely wasn't. I know what I saw. So this happened last year, the week before Christmas. I was 13 years old when this took place. Now, this isn't really as scary as some of the other stories submitted, but it's still pretty unsettling. On this day, I decided to hang out at my mom's workplace, as she owns a small business with no other employees. For some backstory, the area where she's located in isn't really the best. It's pretty much known for drug addicts. The tenants in the building 2 doors down from us actually got evicted for destroying and building and creating a living space for drug addicts and homeless people. They found beds and makeshift showers in there. Anyways, it was around 5 p.m. and clients were coming in and out. Then this guy walked near the large window in the front. Now, he stood there for a while, and I didn't really think too much of it since there's always homeless people roaming around the center. I went to the back to go sit when I then heard the door open. My mom asked if this person needed anything. This raised some red flags since the person never answered the question. I got up to see who it was. The wall was set up so that I could see them, but they couldn't see me. I saw this 6-foot-something white guy just standing there. He was really dirty, and his clothes were all torn up. My mom kept asking this guy questions, but he never answered. He just stood there, staring at her. I was literally shaking. I don't know how to explain it, but the way that he was staring, it just seemed threatening. She threatened to call the police. Nothing. I started recording just in case something happened. She ended up calling the police as well as my dad. The police showed up right in time as the guy then started grabbing his bag for something. They searched the man and they found 2 large knives as well as some really hard drugs in the bag. The guy was obviously arrested, but I'm not really sure what happened to him afterwards. Although nothing insanely really bad happened, I don't really want to think about what would have happened if the police didn't arrive on time. We got lucky. I'm a 30-year-old female, and I'm a current student in nursing. 2020 Thanksgiving went from really exciting to creepy for me. It all started off with me passing an exam at 86% and spending a pre-Thanksgiving with my boyfriend and his family. This particular night right before Thanksgiving, I spent at my brother's house. I left for home around 8 a.m. I woke up exhausted, but my mental state turned manic. I was awake, and I was wanting to get my sister a surprise gift for me and her kids. Because she hadn't replied yet, in my manic state, I decided to go to her house. The day was fun. A lot of food, booze, and dancing. I loved it. At around 6 p.m., I had planned my trip out to my boyfriend's temp house. We got into a bit of an argument, as I told him since it was a 3-hour drive, I'd start around 1 a.m. He didn't really agree with this, as he thought it would be too late and dark to travel to a rural area, which prompted me to remind him I'm grown, which was a bit of a mistake on my part. He became a bit annoyed and upset. However, we later agreed on my arrival. The festives went on at my sister's. Alcohol fun, Thanksgiving family pictures, and a lot of food. Around 11 p.m., I decided to take a nap. However, my manic brain thought to shower. Due to me needing help with running the shower and attempts to fix my hair, I ended up laying down around midnight. I had set an alarm to wake up at 1 a.m., but of course, I slept through it. I was woken up at 3:30 a.m. when my sister then asked me, "Why didn't you leave?" I woke up and desperately moved as fast as I could out of her house. I left my phone and I had to turn around and go back. Once I retrieved the phone, I was finally on my way for a second time. I ended up going in the wrong way, as I mixed up 2 cities' names because they both started with CH. Once the GPS was on and I realized I was going in the wrong direction, I was on my way. Once leaving the city lines of Sacramento, I got into a race with a Silverado that was lifted. In my jealousy that I was in an SUV versus a really beautiful truck, I decided to take on the race. That is, until I reached 120 miles per hour for about 10 minutes and decided it wasn't worth the ticket. At the time, it was only me, the Silverado, and a fellow Ford on the road. About 5 minutes later, the Silverado took an exit. Now it was only me and the fellow Ford in a rural dark area. During the drive, I noticed the Ford was on the side of me, and at one point, they seemed to be close enough right on my right side to swipe me. Due to my blindness in the dark, I was way more focused on making it safely that seemed to even cut off other cars to be on the side of me. We made it to a small town, which meant taking a major street for about 3 to 5 miles, just going through stoplights. At one point I thought, damn, I really hate when people are so close to me like that. It was really annoying to me, but after 2 lights, the fellow Ford turned off, and I honestly felt a bit childish for even caring. 2 to 3 lights down as I made it through the green light, I noticed a car turning onto the street. It was the same car. At this point, my body started to shake as the car made sure it was back on the right side of me, keeping up with persistence this time. My head began to hurt, and at first, I don't think I understood that fear was kicking in. Why would this car come back to the main street? There's only 3 other cars, and he's the one on the side of me. The fight or flight response began to creep up on me, and I didn't want to turn my head as if I noticed. In that moment, I didn't want to call my boyfriend. What if I'm just paranoid? I mean, I've traveled alone for longer distances at night before. Is alcohol still in my system? My boyfriend and mom will lose it if I call them. Why is this happening? In that moment, I saw a light turning yellow as we approached side by side. My brain went into rationalization, and I thought, do not panic, stay calm, ignore the headache. When the light turns green, stay, see if he goes. We approached the light and then stopped. The light seemed to be much longer than the others. I moved my eyes towards the fellow Ford on the side of me. The windows were lightly tinted, but I could see a hat and a person looking towards me. Then seconds later, look up at the light and then peer back into my passenger window. My head and my heart began to become one, both in pain and fear. Then the light turned green. There were 2 cars behind us, but I stayed on my brakes. I didn't move, and I didn't see his car enter the intersection either. I turned my head to look, and I could now see more of the silhouette of the man's face under the hat staring at me. I took off slowly to collect my composure and not seem to be scared, keeping my pace of slowly going through the intersection. I heard a car behind us beep the horn, and it was like a light switch. I noticed a truck in the distance through the last light that was making it through the abyss of the rural highway that was only a 1-lane road. I decided to speed up to make the last light, but so did the fellow Ford, keeping up with my pace. It seemed that he was trying to cut me off, but I went from 45 to 65. The trucks were going slow, and now he was behind me and so close that I could see his lights in full. In a panic, I went off the side of the road as to pull off to pass up the truck, and so did he. When I noticed he passed the truck and was still just as close behind, I noticed the second truck. I sped up to 90 miles per hour and went towards the left, which was into incoming traffic, to cut off the truck. My rationalization was to speed, and even if I was pulled over, I'd be safe. I hoped anyways. I cut off the big rig truck and began to speed up. Now able to see far behind me in the distance through my rearview mirrors, I could see the car trying to cut off the truck to the right and left. But cars were oncoming in the opposite lane, and due to trees to the right, the Ford seemed to weave in and out of the lane. He was trying to erratically cut off the truck. By now, even the truck lights were far behind me. I was going about 120 miles per hour and continued it with no effort, as I'm experienced with driving fast and my adrenaline to flight made it easy. After about 5 to 10 minutes, I slowed down to 80 miles per hour and then to 65 miles per hour after about 30 minutes. An hour later, I'd stopped at a store that appeared to have many customers, which prompted me to stop, as I was paranoid and couldn't be 100% sure the fellow Ford wasn't near me. I went into the store to grab food and coffee, but my appetite was gone, so I just decided on coffee and a smoke. Walking into the store, I saw both customers and employees give me a wide-eyed look, followed with a look of sorrow, which made me feel embarrassed. I was shaking really badly, and my makeup had run all over my face from the crying, and I'm sure I looked like I was coming off of drugs from the fact that my sympathetic nerve was transferring its hard work over to the parasympathetic nerve. In other words, my body was coming off the adrenaline. I went to pay for my coffee and request smokes, but the shaking made it really hard for me to enter my PIN for my debit card. I actually had to try like 3 times. Back to the car I went in fear, my head pounded into my ears. I hoped some tobacco would calm me. The smoke seemed to help calm me down slightly, but the shaking and headache persisted in a bearable manner. The sun was now coming up, and I was almost there. I was still shaking and still upset, and crying on and off. Of course, when I finally made it to my boyfriend's, he could sense it and was able to get the truth out of me. I could see he was upset, but he had tried to console me with a hug and kiss, and encouraging I rest so I could calm down. It was really hard to study that day. The headache really persisted, and I stayed in bed. My boyfriend made the decision for me to not take any more late night drives, and even made sure that I stayed in his dwellings until he was off and with me. It's now days later, and it's dark out, and I'm scared to go out. I really wish I would have listened. 30 years old or not, no person, male or female, should ever think it's okay to drive into rural areas at night. There really are some crazies out there.
So this happened all the way back in the late 1990s when I was a college sophomore. Me and the girl I was dating at the time had been going steady for about 8 months, and since she was my first real girlfriend, my mom was pretty keen to meet her. And what better time than the holidays to introduce her to the folks? During the week before Christmas, my mom's family traditionally held quite a large gathering up at my uncle's place over in Sandy, in my home state of Oregon. Pretty much all my extended family head out there year after year from all over the Portland area, and since they've gotten word that I was bringing my girlfriend, the hype to meet her was huge. I won't lie, I was kind of nervous that they'd embarrass me in front of her, but that anxiety was totally misplaced. She got along really well with all of them, and despite some playful humiliation when the cousin of mine told her the story of how I literally peed my pants at the Haunted Mansion ride when I was a kid, they were a credit to me. And when it came to driving her back home, she seemed to be more into me than ever. We'd agreed to drive back down to Eugene at like 7 p.m. so I wouldn't be too tired driving back. But since we had such a good time, we stayed way later than we had planned to, and didn't get on the road until about 10:30 p.m. that evening. In the hopes of making the journey a little faster, I ended up taking the OR211 instead of just sticking to the I-5S for the whole drive. Annoyingly, this didn't quite actually make the journey any faster, but point being, the OR211 was pretty much surrounded by farms or these huge swaths of dense pine forest. So as you can imagine, big stretches of it aren't lit very well at all, and for some parts of the drive, we were moving through complete darkness, saved only by our car's headlights. But honestly, I wasn't all worried about it. I was pretty good at reading a map, and once I was back on the I-5, a road I knew pretty well, I figured everything would be all good. So we're just cruising along, in high spirits, talking about how goofy some of my family were, but generally my girlfriend was singing their praises and telling how she couldn't wait to meet them again. It's right around then that we hit a section of the highway that descends down this big old hill, heading up to the bridge crossing over Deep Creek. There, the highway is sandwiched by some of the densest forests you've ever likely seen, and there is absolutely nothing lighting up the highway. It's the only thing we can see from the front seats of the cars, like maybe 20 or 30 feet that our headlights are illuminating, and pretty much nothing else. But like I said, we're in high spirits, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Right as the highway was starting to level off, Something darts across the front of us so fast and so suddenly that I barely miss smashing into it. I brake so hard that I almost gave the pair of us whiplash. Then, when we're stopped, both me and my girlfriend are in a complete frenzy of, "Oh God, did you see that? What was that?" There are plenty of deer in that area of Oregon, plenty of coyotes too, but the thing that ran out in front of us was way too big to be a coyote, and something about the way it moved gave me this gut feeling that it wasn't a deer either. The shape was just way too slender, almost like whatever was out there had moved on 2 legs, not 4. Now, next thing, I know how completely dumb this sounds in retrospect, but my curiosity just got the better of me and I decided I wanted to investigate. So again, this was also incredibly dumb. I turned the car like 90 degrees in the highway so I could point our headlights into the woods. Yes, this could have caused a horrible accident if another car had come along at the same time I was doing this, but I don't think I was thinking straight at the time. You see, as a kid growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I've heard a lot of stories about Bigfoot and Sasquatch, and I'd be lying if I said that they didn't capture my imagination. No, I'm not saying that I thought I'd caught a glimpse of Gigantopithecus or anything. I know the stories are mostly exactly that, just stories, but a part of me just wanted to be sure. So like I said, I turned the car 90 degrees, turned on the high beams, and stepped out of the driver's side and onto the highway. I stare off into the trees for a minute or two, but I don't see a thing. Nothing is moving out there, and the whole scene was as quiet as the grave. But as I'm looking, I get this feeling in the pit of my stomach, and start to feel as if though I'd made a huge error of judgment. It was one of the most intensely terrifying feelings I'd ever felt in my entire life, a feeling like I was being watched by something predatory. I know it's a huge cliche, and the whole "I felt like I was being watched" thing is such a tired old trope, but I don't really know any other way to phrase it. My heart was pounding, the hairs on the back of my neck are standing on end, and my gut just turned to ice. So without turning my back to the woods, where I expected the danger to come from, I started edging back towards the car. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, I practically jump out of my skin when I hear the car's horn letting off one long, excruciatingly loud, extended blast. I mean, it scared me so bad that I almost straight up peed my pants, Haunted Mansion style. My first thought was that my girlfriend had ended up leaning on the horn as she climbed over into the driver's seat for some reason, because she'd done that once or twice before. But as I turn back around, I can see she's still on the passenger side, but that she's actually leaning over to push the horn in what was evidently a frenzied attempt to get my attention. I run back to the car and ask her if she's okay, but she doesn't say a single word to me. She just points off to a spot about 50 feet away from where we parked. I spin my head around to see what she's pointing at, and that's when I see it. What was, without a shadow of a doubt, the thing that had run in front of our car just a few minutes prior. Lit up by the residual light of our high beams, what I saw was really obviously a man, but he was covered in animal furs. What looked like a mishmash of deer skins, bear skins, and elk skins, and on his head, secured in a way I'm not even sure of, were these antlers. At the time, because of how closely it was to the holidays, I remember the words "reindeer man" just flashed into my mind. Maybe in the naive hope that the dude was dressed that way out of some misdirected festive spirit. But he certainly didn't seem in any kind of festive spirit, not in the least bit. Like I couldn't see his eyes because of the weird kind of head covering he had on, but I could see his mouth, and at first he kind of looked like he was giving us a smile. Only as I looked, I could see it wasn't a smile at all. This guy was just baring his teeth to us, like the way chimps do as some kind of warning. After that, he turned and walked off into the forest, never to be seen again. Obviously, right after that, me and my girlfriend just got out of there and got back onto the roads towards the I-5. It took us both a while to calm our nerves, but my girlfriend was particularly shaken up, and that's because she'd seen something that I hadn't. And as we drove on, she explained exactly what that was. While I'd been staring off into the woods, looking for Sasquatch or whatever, she'd noticed him out of her peripheral vision, but was basically frozen in fear for a moment or two as she watched him walking slowly towards me. Or rather, walking isn't the right word. From how she described it, this guy was stalking, the way a hunter might stalk a deer. The way she puts it, she had to summon up pretty much all of her courage to be able to lean over and honk the horn the way she did. Then when Reindeer Man had heard the honking, he backed off a little before I saw him, and like I said, he kind of just froze in place before disappearing. I did a fair amount of online research when I got home to try and find out if anyone else had any run-ins with this guy, but there was absolutely nothing online about him. There are plenty of crazy survivalist types up here in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm guessing he was one of those, but they tend to be pretty open about their existence, sometimes even advertise themselves as militiamen or whatever, whereas the Reindeer Man seemed like he was living completely off the grid. I don't live in Oregon anymore. Me and my girlfriend during the encounter broke up at the end of college, but when we were still together and I happened to be driving down towards Eugene, I always avoided the stretch of highway that I saw the Reindeer Man on. I've told this story a lot over the years, and some people honestly just think I'm making it up as like a campfire tale or something. But it's not a tale. It's not made up. And it's definitely not just intended to be some dumb spoopy story. It's most definitely a warning to anyone traveling on that road at night, because if my girlfriend wasn't with me when he ran out in front of the car, if she wasn't there to spot him before he crept up on me, only to scare him off with a blast of the horn, I honestly might not be here to warn you guys. So please, this holiday season, drive careful, drive slow, and do not stop for any reason on dark, deserted stretches of forest highway. During college Christmas break of 2016, I had traveled all the way back to Pennsylvania from California to spend the holidays with my parents. It was kind of weird going from being a mostly independent college kid in a place that hardly ever gets cold to going back to living in my childhood bedroom in a state that becomes a legit winter wonderland around December and January. But I love my mom and dad, and I don't care how much the flight costs. There was no way I was going to spend the holidays alone in Cali. So anyway, my old room is on the second floor of the house, directly above the sliding door that heads out onto the decking in our backyard. It's a really heavy door, so anytime someone opens or closes it, it rumbles right up into my bedroom. This was in a house that was built back in the 50s too, so as you can imagine, the whole place has a lot of creaks and groans to it, but is otherwise pretty sturdy. I should also add at this point that part of the town that my parents live at is pretty safe, with a relatively low crime rate, especially to that of nearby Philly. The most intrusive calls they ever got tended to be from magazine salespeople and the odd Jehovah's Witnesses, and after my dad insisted on debating scripture with them, they stopped calling altogether. Point being, they never had anything remotely close to any kind of break-in or home invasion for the entire time they were living in that property. Next thing is a brief confession from myself here. I picked up a pretty horrible smoking habit during my freshman year of college, so whenever my parents went to bed, I tended to stay up late playing Civ on my laptop, sitting next to my open bedroom window while I smoked and drank tumblers of scotch that I'd pilfered from my dad's liquor cabinet. After midnight, I'd have my window open from anything of 30 minutes to 2 hours. I mean, it would purely depend on how cold it was outside or how tired I was, but I generally let the room air out before spraying some air freshener so that the tobacco smell didn't cling to anything too bad. I also had to use headphones to watch TV and listen to music so it wouldn't wake my mom and dad up. But I tend to only ever use one earphone so I could keep an ear out for anyone coming down the hallway, since they really wouldn't be happy if they found I was smoking in the house. So one night, I was in my usual routine of conquering the known world in an online multiplayer game of Civ when our house alarm suddenly starts blaring. I don't think I'd heard that thing since I was about 6 or 7 years old, and I had completely forgotten about how loud it was. So hearing it had me practically filling my underwear from being frightened out of my skin. Point being, everyone in the house is now wide awake and ready to head off whatever is about to go down. Now my priorities might sound way off here, But initially my big worry wasn't so much that something bad might be happening, like a home invasion or something like that. It was more like me being terrified that my parents were about to realize I'd been smoking and stealing booze from them. I was 20 years old at the time, technically underage, and my parents were old-fashioned types, real sticklers for the rules. If they found out what I'd been doing, there'd be drama, and lots of it. But somehow, when my dad stuck his head around my door all bleary-eyed to make sure he knew where I was, he didn't seem to smell anything. I don't know whether this was because he was too tired and freaked out about the alarms to notice, or that he noticed and actually just didn't care, but either way, he told me to go into their bedroom and stay with my mom until he could give us the all clear. So my dad goes downstairs, I'm assuming with pistol in hand, and gets to work clearing the house, as well as checking the front and backyards to make sure that there's no one hiding in the darker areas out there. He comes back up, tells me and my mom he couldn't find anything and it was probably just a false alarm, and then we all head back to bed. Or rather, they went back to bed. I just went back to being a diplomatic genius on Civ 6. About an hour goes by and I start getting pretty tired, so I get up to close my bedroom window before heading to bed when the alarm goes off again. Once again, my dad goes downstairs, does a sweep of the grounds floor and the yards, then comes back to tell me not to worry and that he figured it was just the wind or something. I mean, it had been a pretty windy night, which honestly suited me because it meant the breeze aired my room out. Like I said, it was an old house, so it wasn't out of the question that the wind could have rattled the doors or windows and set the alarm off. The point being that both me and my dad were chill about the alarm going off. Neither of us thought there was anything to worry about. So the next morning at breakfast, my dad is going through the alarm system's app on his iPhone, checking out some of the data readouts from the night before. All of a sudden, he's all like, "Okay, that's weird. Apparently the backsliding doors were opened 14 times last night." Number one, I was impressed the alarm system was so sophisticated that it could feed him that kind of info. I guess he shelled out big boy cash for that thing. But number two, how could it have been opened that many times? Then I'm not kidding, like 5 to 10 minutes later, there's a knock at our front door, and it's the neighbor guy from the house down the street. He asked us if we had any intruders over the previous night, and we tell him no, or that at least we didn't think so. It's then that he tells us that he actually caught someone on a security camera trying to break into his house, that the dude had tried to jimmy a lock or something before looking right up into the camera before getting spooked and bailing. We assumed that this is about the time that he moved on to our house, then kept at it when he realized it was the weaker target. That seriously freaked me out. The whole time I'd been sitting there, innocently playing games, sipping stolen scotch, there had been a guy trying to get into our house, maybe only 6 or 7 feet below me. If I'd have bothered to look out the window at any point directly downward, I'd have locked eyes with the guy. He must have smelled my cigarette smoke, known someone was home, and it just didn't bother him in the least bit. He was more than prepared to face off with someone, although apparently not when he'd seen my dad with his pistol, sweeping the house and yards in the dark. I've always liked a scary story or a good horror film. Ghosts, vampires, werewolves, they're my jam. I've never found, like, serial killers or whatever to be that scary, though. Like, I didn't think that the human element to the horror was particularly potent. After that night, though, that all changed. It struck me how evil and predatory human beings can really be, how that guy had been creeping around in our backyard for basically hours right under my nose, and I'd had absolutely no clue he was there. It's how he managed to just disappear when the alarm went off, too, and how he had the balls to come back once we'd all gone back to bed. I mean, he was like a ghost or something, just vanishing into the darkness. I mean, think about it. My dad had checked out the backyard, tried to make sure that there was no one hanging around, hiding out in the dark spots underneath the trees, and there had been. There had been someone there, just watching my dad walking around in his slippers or whatever he had on, just waiting for him to call off the search before creeping back up towards the house. Just thinking about it now gives me shivers, and now that I'm back in Cali writing this, I always make sure that all the windows and doors in my dorm are locked, and that I double or triple check whenever I think something bad is about to go down or whatever, because sometimes it seems you'll never know if someone is just lurking in the shadows until it's way, way too late. This is an experience my wife and I just had this past year. As soon as the quarantine was lifted in our area, she and I filled our packs and went for a hike at our local state park. It was something we used to do pretty regularly and have since before we got married. Speaking for myself, I was really looking forward to it. The plan was to hike out to a certain lake, spend the night, and hike back to the car. It was a clear, warm day and the trails were nice and dry. For most of that morning, we had been the only people on the trail. We decided to stop for lunch at a campsite about halfway to the lake. Another couple must have had the same idea. They were sitting at the concrete picnic table and we asked to join them. Soon, the four of us were discussing what we had seen and where we were headed. The couple turned out to be newlyweds on their honeymoon. My wife, who's a hopeless romantic, loved to hear this. She proceeded to tell them how we'd met and some other sappy stuff I don't bother to remember. 2 hours passed and we finally said our goodbyes. We arrived at the lake about an hour before dark, tired and hungry. I got a fire started and Mandy, my wife, cooked us a small meal while I pitched the tent. We sat around the fire cooking s'mores and eventually called it a night at around 10 p.m. I got up just before dawn the next morning and got the fire ready to make the breakfast. We repeated our roles from the night prior, except I pulled the tent down and repacked it. All the measures were taken to ensure the fire was completely out after cooking, and with that, we took to the trail for the return journey. At 10 a.m., we reached the halfway point, but chose not to stop. 2 hours up the trail, we ran into the husband of the couple we'd met the day before. Strangely, his wife wasn't with him. Mandy asked him about her location, and the man said that she'd become ill the night before and returned home. When he said it, he looked nervous and couldn't look either of us in the eyes. Before either of us could ask anything else, he said that his wife had insisted he finish the trip alone. It sounded a bit strange, but we had no reason not to believe him. A group of people came walking up about that same time, and the husband excused himself to talk to them. I wasn't interested in prying any further. Their marriage was none of my business, I thought. Mandy looked like she wanted to stay, but I reminded her of the obligations we had that night. She reluctantly agreed and we went on our way. We got to the parking lot not too long after and packed up our stuff. There were a few groups of people talking amongst themselves. As we pulled out of the lot, several more cars, including a ranger's truck, were pulling in. Once again, I thought nothing of it. We made it back home that afternoon and handled some family things. It wasn't until breakfast that we heard the news. I had grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down in front of the TV. I flipped it on just in time to receive a report of a dead female camper. When they showed her face on the screen, I almost choked on my coffee. It was a picture of the woman we had met just 2 days prior. I yelled out to Mandy to join me in the living room. I wanted to be sure of what I was seeing. I didn't have my glasses on at the time, and I pointed at the TV and asked, "Isn't that one of the newlyweds we met at the park?" She watched for a moment and let out a shocked gasp. Just then, a wedding photo of the couple appeared on the screen. Mandy grabbed the remote from my hand and turned up the volume. According to the husband, the couple had been at a cliffside that was a popular lookout. Mandy and I had been there once or twice ourselves in the past. They had watched the sun rise, and as they were preparing to turn and leave, the wife lost her footing and fell several hundred feet to the ground below. It was certainly possible, but something bothered me about it. Why hadn't he mentioned this to us? More so, what was up with the illness story? It couldn't have been more than a few hours after the incident had occurred. None of his behavior made any sense. I know if something such as that happened to me, I'd have been a mess. We had passed at least 15 people that morning and not a soul talked to us. It all seemed fishy to me. I was glad to see that Mandy agreed with me. It looked as if though her instincts had been right once again. Just don't tell her I said that. After a long discussion about our responsibilities and the like, we agreed that we should contact the law enforcement involved in the case. And as it stood, the husband isn't under any suspicion. Not publicly, anyways. I contacted the sheriff's office and told them what we knew. The deputy put us on hold for a moment, and when he returned, he said someone may reach out to us in the future. But it's been almost a year and no one has contacted us. And this is what brings me to emailing you here. What do you think? My instincts and my wife's tell us that a crime may have occurred. We, however, have no proof or any real justification for our feelings, and that's just what they are, feelings. Certainly, if law enforcement believed we had something to offer, they would have already contacted us, right? I don't want to be a nuisance, nor do I want to cause trouble for a grieving man who, by all appearances, is a decent person. But help me out here. Should I keep pushing or leave the police to do their jobs? I just can't shake this nagging feeling that a man is getting away with cold-blooded murder. My childhood was anything but stable. After divorcing my father, my mom dated a long string of losers. She even moved a few in, and around 14, she married a guy named Frank that she had met in the bar that she worked at. Frank was an outright a-hole and tried in vain to usurp my father's role. Mom had done her best to keep Dad and I apart, but I knew the whole time he loved and wanted to be with me. Prior to the divorce, he and I would hunt, fish, and camp regularly. This instilled a love for the outdoors I'll never shake, nor would I want to. This made my decision to live in the woods almost a no-brainer. I was 17 when I couldn't take Frank's tyranny anymore. Despite being an unemployed bum for most of the time, he expected me to wake up by 8 a.m. every day. Unlike him, I worked 5 days a week. I've been saving to get my own place since my junior year. Getting away from him and my mom were high on my priorities list. So much so I quit school at the end of my first semester and got my GED. Dad wasn't happy to hear about it, but he signed the waiver because he understood. On my days off, I felt I'd earned the right to sleep in. Frank disagreed for some reason. I'd felt a lot of pressure at work at the time. When Frank came in yelling for me to wake up, I told him to F off. He drew back like he was going to hit me, and I reacted by knocking him to the floor. This was the breaking point. I knew that little wimp would call the cops, so I packed my backpack as fast as I could and hit the road, and I've never lived there again. With no clear plan or car, I roamed aimlessly for most of the day. As the sun began to fall, I slipped off into a patch of woods on the edge of town. I walked in far enough to not be seen from the road and made camp. I threw together a fire and fashioned a bed from clothes and leaves. That night was surprisingly comfortable, but I had no intent on making it a long-term thing. In my arrogant mind, I'd have no trouble finding an abandoned place to sleep until I'd saved enough. It didn't turn out to be that easy. Most places anywhere decent enough had security. The one spot that didn't was controlled by a gang. They used it as a shooting gallery, I felt like. The floor was an inch deep in old needles. Life with Frank was preferable to that. Another weekend was coming to an end. Sleep and safety were on my top priorities, so I returned to my forest camp and did the best with what I had. Sleeping on the ground wasn't going to work for the long term. The middle of that first week, I walked to a Walmart after work and grabbed a few things, a sleeping bag most importantly. A little time investment made my sleeping arrangements a lot better. I also made a simple lean-to structure from a tarp and lined it with foil. The foil reflected the heat from the fire back down onto my body, making the cooler nights much less so. For a long time, I would clean up the best I could in public bathrooms. My clothes were cleaned at our 24-hour laundromat. It wasn't uncommon for me to spend the night there on laundry days. My hygiene did manage to draw a little attention from my bosses, but none ever said anything. And I did eventually find a fork of river that ran near my camp. I'd bathe there as often as I could. Overall, my time there was a lot better than it could have been had I not had a job. Employed or not everything was idealistic as I made it sound. My little patch of woods was bisected by railroad tracks. With railroad tracks come hobos, and about half a mile from my camp and across the track lay the hobos' camp. It wasn't really much more than an overnight place for most of those guys. I first stumbled upon it by chance. I used the tracks as a quiet pathway back and forth each day. If the police saw you walking alongside the busier roads, they'd harass you. This isn't something I wanted or needed. I was still technically a minor after all. One evening, as I returned to my campsite, the glow of a fire reflecting off the leaves caught my sight. I walked toward it and began to hear a group of men talking. I carefully peeked down the hill and saw 3 older men hunched around the fire. I just watched and listened for a few minutes. Eventually, I realized they weren't anyone to worry about and called down to them. They looked up and huddled together. They must have decided I wasn't a threat either. They called me down to join them. At first, I just sat there and listened to their stories, but after some time, they asked me my name and where I was headed. I thought for a minute, before just making up that my name was Frank and I lived nearby. This spurred an hours-long conversation about all types of things. I learned about a life of riding the rails, and I told them a little about my situation. At some point that night, I got to taste fortified wine for the first time. It's not something I'd recommend, but I came to form quite an affinity for it. Nothing exciting would happen that night, and not for a long time. It was with the approach of fall that seemed to bring with it the cold wind, obviously, but not to mention a few ill-mannered hobos too. By this point, I'd almost come to be one of the train-hopping fraternity. The few regulars and I had spent many a cool evening by the fire, listening to the newcomers' stories and passing around a bottle or two. One of those passing through was an older guy called Tampa. He was quiet at first, but became more belligerent the more intoxicated he became. I'm not sure what I said, but something set him off and he took a swing at me. Before I knew it, I was on the ground being kicked. The other guys got him to stop long enough for me to get away, and after that night I made sure to keep my distance when someone I didn't know was around. This rule served me well until I allowed myself to be tricked by someone that I thought I knew. The second incident is what ultimately led me finally getting my own apartment earlier than I had planned. The run-in with Tampa was fading from my mind. Other more important things like staying warm and fed were occupying most of my thoughts. Somehow, despite being a homeless teenager, I managed to get a promotion at work. I may have allowed them to believe that I quit school to invest more time there. True or not, the promotion brought with it a raise. I'd been spending most of my money just trying to stay alive. Now, living would be a lot easier. And I was gathering wood one Saturday and noticed a guy about my age walking toward me with a backpack. Although leery, he seemed normal enough to me. He had just come from a Kansas City. I forgot to ask which one, and he told me his name was Dallas. We began talking and I told him about the camp. He thanked me and went our separate ways. Later that night, we continued our conversation around the fire as a bottle made its way among us. For the next 2 days, I spent my evenings with Dallas and the rest of the guys listening to their amazing tales of riding the rails. All seemed well until that second evening. Earlier that day, I'd made a slip-up and mentioned it was payday. I'd always been cagey when it came to how much money I made. A few of the guys knew I had a steady job, but even with them, I never let them see me with more than a few dollars. Since my earliest days, I'd had caches where I'd hide most of my money. I made sure to constantly move it at irregular times and intervals. Being paranoid was preferable to being robbed. That evening, Dallas and I were discussing a private matter. I hadn't taken the time to stash my money before I left camp, and Dallas seemed to have known it. I realized now that he had been spending his days searching for my current cash. When he couldn't find it, I guess he assumed I was carrying it on me. During our conversation, he asked if he could borrow some money. I told him I had given all I had to pay for the bottle we just had. He called me a liar and produced a long pocket knife. Obviously, I was terrified. Nonetheless, losing almost $1,000 must have scared me more. I held on to the lie as long as I could, but the fear overtook me and I started begging. His face had changed to a look of pure evil. I knew he had no problem killing me. My flight response kicked in and was going to run, and just as I began to turn, Dallas took a wide swipe at me. I was out of range for the cut to be too bad, but I was slashed across my left arm regardless. I was now too scared to turn away, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. I began jogging backward up the hill, watching Dallas the whole time. I'd taken about 5 steps and watched as he folded up and collapsed. It didn't make any sense until I made out the shape of another person standing behind him, with something long in his hand. I called out and Johnny, one of the regulars, stepped up into the dim light. Johnny was holding his trademark axe handle. I thanked him and he proceeded to tell me he had been watching Dallas all evening. While he and a few others had been in the liquor store, Dallas had made an offhanded comment about me being Mr. Moneybags. He figured Dallas had something planned. Dallas was beginning to stir by now and cursing Johnny. Johnny simply looked down at him and said, "Get," and added that if he didn't, he would get an even worse beating. Dallas did as he's told and disappeared into the night, hopefully forever. And for safety's sake, I spent that night and a few more after at the hobo camp. I made sure to take a different path to and from work for the rest of the week. I didn't see Dallas again, but my second assault in less than a year was too much for me. I had had enough to get a place by this point anyhow. I was hoping to have a little more, but that seems to always be the case in life, right? I spent that weekend at the library, going over classifieds on Craigslist, and late that Sunday evening I was sleeping in my very own apartment. It was a tiny little dump, but it was mine. A few months later, I found a better, more permanent situation and spent a full 3 years there. I still think about Johnny and the other guys from time to time. They were nothing like you'd expect people in that life to be, but even being surrounded by a group of good guys like that, camping or sleeping rough as some call it, isn't something I'd recommend to anyone. In the late spring of 2017, I embarked on my long-anticipated camping trip out west. The trip was almost 2 years in the planning stage and would be my first chance to camp with firearms. The journey to the location was an enjoyable experience, and I learned a lot about that part of our country I wasn't aware of. On arrival, I parked my truck and notified my contact that I'd arrived safe. We went over my agenda one last time and I began the long hike to my campsite. Things went quietly that first day. The weather was so nice I slept under the stars next to my fire. The freedom I felt was refreshing as opposed to all the restrictions we'd had back home. The following day was much like the one before. I walked at a leisurely pace and enjoyed all the wildlife around me. A bit after 1 p.m. I finally found the spot I'd hoped to camp. A quick scan told me that I'd made a wise decision. In no time everything was set up and I was cooking my lunch. I could feel myself dozing off afterwards, so I took the opportunity to do some shooting. After all, this is why I was out here. Around 200 yards from camp, I found a dry creek bed. It looked to be the safest place to shoot. I set up a few steel targets and let lead fly. I can't describe the elation I felt. This must have been how the mountain men lived, I told myself. I'd gone through a box of 7.62 and was reloading my SKS when the sound of gunshots echoed through the hills around me. My curiosity drove me to check out their source. The shots continued as I searched. They sounded as if though they were coming from multiple guns, and this made me a bit nervous. I chose to return to camp, and something told me from the sound of the shots that I wouldn't be welcome, and it's a decision I still regret and thank myself to this day. Back at camp, I began considering what I'd have for dinner. The shooting had stopped soon after I'd returned. I assumed the shooters had moved on and the evening would be quiet. Once I finished cleaning my guns, which took me about an hour, I laid back and stared at the fire. I caught myself nodding off again, so rather than cook something big, I filled up on a sleeve of crackers and bacon-flavored easy cheese. The sun was beginning to slip behind the trees, and I took this as a sign to crawl off to bed for an early night. It was completely dark when a noise awakened me. I jolted up and peeked out of my tent. Nothing was there. I figured it was a dream and laid back down. Just as I closed my eyes, I heard it again. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the night. Next to hearing a rabbit being killed by a predator, it was the worst sound I'd ever heard. The screams came again, but this time was followed by a female voice screaming for help. Things got real in that moment. I felt a shiver through my body. What was I going to do? I briefly considered grabbing my rifle and running off into the dark. It was clear by now where the sounds were coming from, the same direction the shots had been coming from earlier. Common sense won out and I stayed where I was. One more scream for help came and was followed by a single gunshot, and I laid frozen in terror, wondering what to do until the sun rose the next morning. My feelings of freedom and power were gone now. I waited, minute after minute, for the dawn so I could escape the coming death I had convinced myself was coming. With the sunrise, my kit was packed in record time and I was on my way, back to a place I perceived as oppressive, or anywhere for that matter, anywhere but there. A trip which had taken me in a day and a half to make just a few days before took less than one to return from. It was a miracle I'd make it back at all. Every few minutes I'd turn around, rifle gripped tightly in my hand, looking for some imaginary pursuers. I arrived back in my truck just after dark and turned for home, never happier to be returning. After the relief began to wear off, the guilt began to set in. As far as I could tell, I had hurt a woman in need for help, being murdered perhaps, and I did nothing about it, not a thing. For the entire drive back, a war waged between my ego and common sense. One second I hated myself, calling myself a coward, and the next, you were obviously outnumbered. There's nothing you could do. The undeniable facts are that all those things are true. I was indeed a coward, scared as a child that sees his first horror movie. But at the same time, running out into the pitch dark after an unknown number of assailants would have been very, very stupid. Though it's still the sting in my ego I feel the strongest to this day. Any man could tell you why. Coward or hero, none of this amounted to much. The real question is if I was going to report what I'd witnessed. Witnessed? That was a word that would undo my great act of virtue. I really didn't witness anything. I heard a few screams and shots out in the middle of nowhere, hardly a groundbreaking indictment. Without any real evidence, I'd be no more than a nuisance to the cops, and that was it. And my punishment, it's been this unending shame of picking logic and reason over common decency. It would be some months until I would discover the facts that surrounded this incident, and for some time I was too terrified at what I would find. Nonetheless, a day came when I was finally able to summon the courage to seek out the truth, and it turned out to be a mixed bag somewhat. To be brief, I just happened to be camping a mile away from an outlaw biker gang. Earlier in that day, they had arrived at the site that they used in the past to shoot their less than legal firearms. Unfortunately, they had also abducted a female backpacker. After horribly abusing her for several hours, they set her free. She fled from their campsite. This must have been the screams that I heard for help, only to be shot and left for dead. Most of the time, this would be where the terrible story would end. However, by some act of God, the backpacker clung to life. Somehow she made her way back to the highway and found help. After a week in the hospital, she was released. The bikers knew that they were caught and took deals that will see most of them serving the remainder of their lives in prison. Although I was genuinely happy to hear the victim was alive, the thought of what-ifs haunt me to this day. I'd never told anyone about this incident. Choosing to use this throwaway account means I probably never will. If you end up reading this and thinking me as a low-life coward, I really don't blame you. I didn't tell this story for folks like you. Rather, this account is for those that believe it's the best policy to not get involved in others' problems. I understand now your desire to avoid conflict. Many have been punished for doing the right thing. You may end up as one of those people if you assist someone in need. Your life might be ruined because of it. I can tell you from first-hand experience that pales in comparison to the guilt you'll carry around for the rest of your life. It's simple. We're here on this earth together. If able, we should help our fellow human beings in need. Put yourself in your neighbor's shoes. You could be the only thing standing between them living or dying. I had a really horrible experience during a summer trip for our school program. It was a JROTC summer camp, and for those of you not familiar with the program, it basically gives you basic military understanding. You go on runs, do marching commands, stuff like that. It's offered in most high schools in the United States. I come from a family of military professionals, so it just seemed like a logical choice. Even though I didn't plan on joining the military myself, I am a pretty short girl. My name is Caitlin, and during camp I met a nice guy. He was in my squad during a particular practice exercise, and I thought he was a really great guy. We didn't get to spend too much time together, though. The boys and the girls slept in separate buildings, and most of the time, we didn't get placed in the same squad for activities. I remember thinking that he was really funny and cute. He was one of those guys who somehow had the ability to make jokes that didn't have to hurt anyone's feelings, and I always thought that was rare. If you think about it, it's really difficult. When was the last time you made a joke that wasn't at the expense of someone else? So I guess I valued that, and it was one of the things that attracted me to him. Like I said, we didn't get to spend a lot of time together, and it just made me want to be with him more. We exchanged phone numbers on the last day in the hopes that we would date sometime after we got out. We kept in touch for the following weeks, and everything seemed good. The only problem was that he lived about 30 minutes away from me. We were both seniors in high school, and that is a long trip for someone that makes minimum wage part-time. We talked on and off again for a few months, but it didn't really go anywhere, and I just figured that I would let it die. That was until around late October. He started talking to me a lot. I remember we became really close, and we talked on the phone a whole bunch and were texting each other obsessively. My family got mad at me at Thanksgiving because I was on my phone the whole time, and I could not get enough of him. He seemed so interested in me. I later found out this because he had just broken up with his girlfriend. I didn't even know that he was in a relationship, but yeah, he got interested in me once he was out of that last relationship. He still kind of flirted with me before, though. Still not sure how I feel about that, and it seemed kind of sketchy. I remember at one point the conversation just became a little dry for me. I got a little less interested. Not exactly sure why, he just seemed so into me. He texted me obsessively, even a few weeks later, and my interest started to wane. That's when he started getting really brave over text messages. He would say really intimate, almost too personal things to me, even started sending me dirty pictures of himself. And not just regular pictures, like very dirty pictures, if that gives you any kind of inclination. This one time he kept saying that he wanted to sleep at my house. He said that he could borrow his mom's car over the weekend, but he didn't want to drive all the way back until the next day. He kept asking if he could just sleep in my house. Obviously, my mom would have said no. She wasn't the kind of parent that would just let a boy sleep over, and my dad would have murdered him if he had ever found out that he was trying to sleep over. Well, he just showed up one day. Literally just came to my house. I mean, what in God's name was he thinking? I had given him my address before, but this was completely unannounced, and we had been talking for months prior. It was just a really freaky and unexpected thing. He brought me flowers and chocolate, the whole thing that would be really sweet if it wasn't so creepy. It just gave me a really bad vibe. I ended up spending the day with him. We went to the park down the street and got coffee, but he still insisted on trying to sleep over. I told him no, and after getting a little pushy, he gave in and drove home at about 11 at night. Other than the weirdness, the day didn't go that bad. I did still find him funny and charming. I just had some subtle warning signs about him that made me a little uncomfortable, and looking back, I should have paid more attention to those. Now here's the crazy time that put our relationship to an end. He tried getting me to sleep over at his house. He began getting really forceful. At one point, he threatened to hurt me if I didn't try to sleep over at his house. I kept trying to tell him that my parents would not let me sleep over at a boy's home, but he didn't care. It was a big ultimatum, and that was that. I know. Messed up, but he had me under his spell, and it worked. And here's how he tried to spin it to my parents. He had a younger sister, and I tried telling my mom that I wanted to sleep over at my friend's house. That was the girl. And I wanted her to drive me over there. Keep in mind, I didn't have my car or a learner's permit or anything. I was kind of scared of driving, if I'm going to be honest. Anyway, I just told my parents that I wanted to sleep at a friend's house, and they were completely on board. They didn't have a problem with it, obviously. I had done it many times before. My mom drove me over there, and when we got there, the only person home was him, and his family wasn't coming back until Monday. He didn't even tell me that he was home alone for the weekend. My mom had no idea that there was going to be no parental supervision. She is kind of overbearing with stuff like that, so she asked him to speak with his parents. She just wanted to double check that everything was good, and that they were okay with the situation. Well, as you might imagine, it wasn't long before my mom figured the situation out. She drove me back home, and that was the end of that whole situation. I texted him and asked him why didn't he tell me that no one was going to be home, and he literally told me that he was going to do horrible things to me. He got mad at me because he wasted his entire family vacation time on trying to get freaky with me, and he didn't get to do anything. I thought he was just playing some kind of joke on me, but then he started sending me pictures of some weird torture stuff. I don't know if they were weird toys or what. He specifically told me something he was going to make his dog do to me. Yeah, some pretty sick stuff. And I was freaking horrified after that. I had no idea that he was such a freak. I always had a bad feeling about him, but I never listened to that voice in the back of my head. Anyway, my mom told me I wasn't allowed to talk to him anymore, and she was really unhappy that I was being deceitful with her, and I can understand that. If it hadn't been for my mom, God only knows what would have happened. To this day, I still don't really know why I went along with everything for so long. It was like he had me hypnotized or something. I haven't spoken to or heard from him since, and I don't think I want to, either. I don't remember exactly how old I was at the time, maybe 14 or 15. I had this really crazy guy that lived on my street. Everyone called him Crazy Mike, and he really was as crazy as you could imagine, but more on him in a minute. I had this one friend that was a little wild. We'll call him Charlie. He was kind of the adventurous friend that got me to do some crazy stuff. We went through a phase for about 2 or 3 months where we hung out a lot, and it was honestly a lot of fun. One of the things we would do is explore the nearby woods. There was a lot of wildlife, and anyone could go out there and explore as far as they wanted. We lived on a mountain, and we would hike up the mountain, and when we had enough for the day, we would hike back down. We normally took the regular roads back down because it was just a little bit easier to get home that way. My friend lived a few roads up from me, so I would walk up to his house with him and then go home by myself. I remember this one particular day we had gone hiking through the creek. Bear in mind, it was freezing outside at the time. There was snow on the ground and a lot of water was frozen. At one point, we had the bright idea of walking on the ice. As you might imagine, we fell into the water. It wasn't very deep or anything, not even enough to get above our chest, but we were dripping with water, and it was about 5 degrees outside, and there was snow on the ground. But being the crazy kids we were, it didn't stop us. We just continued hiking even after we got soaking wet. I don't know if we just had a really high tolerance to the cold or it was adrenaline, and we were all good. We continued on for a couple of hours that day. But after a certain point, I finally talked him into heading home for the day. He agreed, and we went out and got on the road. We made our way back down like usual. But this is the point when I started freezing. I was too cold, and I knew my body. I knew that I was in some kind of danger, like getting near hypothermia or something. When we got to my friend's house, he was more than willing to let me come in and warm up for a few minutes. But just as we were getting to his house, my mom called him. She was really angry with me because I hadn't answered my phone in an hour. I tried explaining the situation to her, but she just screamed at me over and over again to come home. So I had to walk the rest of the way home, and that was that. This is where Crazy Mike comes in, because he lives one road above me, and it saves me about 10 minutes of walking if I cut through a part of his property to get to my house. He had a big fence, but so did his neighbor. There was a small walkway kind of area between the two spots. I was obviously in a rush to get back home and warm up. In fact, I was jogging most of the way. I hadn't heard anything about Crazy Mike by this point, so I figured it would be okay if I cut through his property this one time. I started going through, and that's when he came out of his house with a rifle. He pointed it at me and started screaming at me like a maniac. Of course, I turned around and sprinted away. I ran all the way back home and told my mother. She thought I was exaggerating and that I shouldn't have been cutting through people's property anyway, and that was when I started asking people around the area about him. I heard some stories about Crazy Mike and some of the things he would do. I heard that he was a conspiracy theorist, a drug dealer, criminal, felon, and a bunch of other nutty stuff. If I had to sum it all up in a single phrase, he was a bad guy. Whoever I asked never had anything good to say about him, and the part that freaked me out was that I still had to pass Crazy Mike's house on my way home. I didn't have to cut through his property, but I did still have to walk in front of his house on the road to get to my house, and that made me terribly uncomfortable. Because now I was constantly worried that I was going to get shot or something. I still would go hiking with Charlie and all that, and after a couple of times of going home, there was no incident, so I thought that was going to be the end of it. However, I noticed something else. He had video cameras on the outside of his property looking out onto the road. I'd never noticed them before, but now that I was aware of his insanity, I paid a little bit more attention. Whenever I walked by, the cameras would follow me. What freaked me out the most was that they were manually operated cameras. They weren't the kind of cameras that just followed motion around. He was sitting there operating those cameras every single time I ever walked by, watching me. I'm not sure if he was recording all the footage or not, but he made me uncomfortable either way. I remember there was this one time when I was walking home from Charlie's house at night. It must have been about 10 or 11. It was really late, and even then, the cameras followed me as I walked by. I thought that was going to be it, that nothing else was going to happen between me and Crazy Mike. Well, I was dead wrong. It was still during the same winter season, and I was walking home during a blizzard. And that was just the kind of guy I was. My mom was going to order pizza that night, and I didn't want to miss it. I passed by Crazy Mike's like I always did, and that was when something unexpected happened. He had this giant fence, and it had to have been 15 feet tall, and it was this really thick wood. Part of it opened up, and a dog ran out after me. I couldn't tell what kind of dog it was, but it was angry and barking at me really loud, and ran after me, and I could tell that it was going to bite me as hard as it could. I got a seriously violent vibe. I was lucky that I was in really good shape and managed to sprint away, having a head start. Didn't slip or anything else either. That situation could have turned out really bad, really fast. But either way, my family ended up moving a few weeks later for unrelated reasons. My mom actually got a new job in a different state, and that was the end of my experience with Crazy Mike. Even now I wonder what his problem was. Was he some kind of drug dealer or criminal? Why was he so paranoid about some kid walking in front of his house or cutting through a piece of his property? I've asked my friend on Facebook a couple of times if he's heard anything about Crazy Mike, and apparently nothing has changed. So make of that what you will. I guess the moral of the story is that you should avoid crazy people as much as you can. Sometimes just walking in front of their house.
Hey friends, if you enjoyed these stories animated by the awesome Martin Animations, but you want to hear more, be sure to head over to my channel, Let's Read, to hear the rest of these spooky tales.
I've always gone out shopping on Black Friday for many years now. But 2 years ago was by far the scariest experience I've ever had. It was Thanksgiving Day, and I was excited to go buy a new TV. I was planning on going to Target for a big sale they were having on electronics, and they were opening at 6 p.m. on Thanksgiving night. I was at my parents' place, and they had over quite a few of our family members from my mom's side of the family. I chatted with all of them, and then had dinner with everyone. Then I left their house to Target to go buy a giant TV. I arrived at Target about 20 minutes before they opened. I saw that there was already a decent-sized line of people waiting to get inside. It wasn't too long, though, and I figured I still had a decent chance of getting the TV I wanted. I got out of my car and went to the back of the line. And as I did, I saw a few other people get in line behind me. I waited in line for the remaining minutes until I saw the doors to Target being unlocked. I watched as people started to go inside, then I walked quickly with everyone else, and once I got inside, I made a beeline for the electronics department. The store was really crowded, and it was hard to get through everyone, but I was able to make it there in a few minutes without running into anyone or anything like that. I got to the TVs to see a few people had already grabbed the size and brand that I had wanted, which was 50 inches. I walked quickly over to them, and just as I did, I saw another person grab one to reveal that there was just one more left behind it. I quickly reached out and got the last one. I was so happy to actually have it in my hands, because I had been pretty nervous I wouldn't be able to get it. I knew how quickly they would sell out. Probably 2 or 3 seconds after I had gained full control of it, someone came from my right side and grabbed the TV that I had in my arms. It started to come out of my hands until I grabbed it and pulled it back. At that point, the person shoved me a little bit and I almost gave up the TV. I turned and saw a man wearing a blue coat and a slight beard. He was looking at me, and as we made eye contact, he said that I had his TV. I said sorry to the man, but I had gotten the last one. The man started to turn and walk away, but then did a 360 turn and came back to me. He then asked me if I could please give it to him. I really didn't want to, and I said no, I'm sorry. He then told me how he would have got to the TV sooner, but somebody had gotten in his way. Then he added he thought he had got to the TV before me as well. I knew the man was behind me and I had got to it before him. He had tried to take it out of my hands after I already had it. I didn't want to cause a scene, but I wasn't going to give up the last TV to him, so I told him sorry one last time and started towards the check lanes. The man followed me all the way there, trying to reason with me. The more we walked, the angrier he became. It came to the point where I just started to ignore him. I finally got to the check lane, and he cursed at me and walked away. I checked out and walked my TV to my car in the parking lot and loaded it up. But as I was putting my TV in my car, I saw the man start to approach me once again. This time I got a bad feeling. It was a different environment out in the parking lot where there were less people around. I hurried up as fast as I could and then shut the door. The man was standing there from about 20 feet away, flipping me off. Then he got into a car that was parked nearby. I ignored him, and I actually felt kind of bad for the guy because I knew how great of a deal I was getting on the TV, but I also knew I didn't owe it to him to give him the last one. I started up my car and began to drive away. I drove back to my house to drop off the TV. My house was close to the Target, as well as my parents' house. As I turned onto my street, I noticed a car turn behind me. Then, as I was pulling into my driveway, I saw the car stop in front of my driveway. I got a terrible feeling. The car then started to honk. I looked and saw the man from Target yelling something out his window. Then he sped away in his car. I was glad he was gone, but I was a little concerned that he now knew where I lived. The man seemed to be a little crazy to get so worked up over a TV. I brought my TV in the house. Then I locked it up and went back to my parents for the rest of Thanksgiving. I stayed there until about 10 p.m., then drove back to my place. When I got there, I just felt suspicious. I was worried the guy had tried to break into my house or something when I was gone, but I figured I was just being paranoid. I looked around from my car at my place and everything seemed fine, so I got out and headed for the front door. But as I made it to about 10 feet from my door, I noticed something. I had a couple of pillars in front of my house, and behind the side of the right pillar, I saw what appeared to be an arm. I knew who it had to be. I wanted to run away, but didn't want to make it obvious. I quickly stopped in my tracks, but said, "Forgot my phone," to myself. I was hoping this would work. Then I turned around and started walking back to my car calmly. The man seemed to buy it, and I wanted badly to run to my car, but I decided to remain calm. I didn't hear or notice the man moving at all, but when I reached about 10 feet from my car, I couldn't take it anymore. I broke into a sprint and ran the rest of the way. As I had reached my car, I heard the man now running after me. I got inside quickly and drove away as fast as I could. As I did, I felt something hit the car. It seemed like a rock. I drove back to my parents' place and told them everything. There was a decent-sized dent in the side of my car. I stayed there for the night and we called the police as well. However, I don't believe the man was ever caught, but at least I never did hear from him again. This happened on Black Friday about 5 years ago. I was a young 19-year-old woman in my second year of college. I lived pretty close to my school, so I was able to work at a nearby clothing store which was in a pretty big shopping center. I was scheduled to work on Black Friday, which I had done the year before. I knew it would be a long shift and really busy, but I also knew I was getting paid extra, so it was worth it. I got to work early on the morning of Black Friday. We opened at 6 a.m. and I was there. The store I worked at was pretty big, so we had a lot of people working. I was mainly a cashier, but I would also do other tasks as well. As I was working at the cash register shortly after we opened, a man came and checked out in my line. He was middle-aged and bald, and I remember he had a missing tooth in the front. As he was standing there, I could feel him just staring at me the whole time. Then he complimented me on my outfit and seemed to give off a bit of a creepy feeling, but I was nice to him and knew it was just part of the job. After that, he left. About an hour later, I moved from cashier to working in the women's department. As I was folding some clothes, I noticed the man once again. We were pretty busy, not enough where people were lined up outside or anything, but we were much busier than any other day. So I found it strange how I saw the same man once again about an hour later. But the part that I really didn't like is how I caught him just staring at me once again. When we made eye contact, he quickly looked away. It was as if he was almost hiding behind a rack of clothes. I did my best to mind my own business, and eventually the man was gone. About 10 minutes later, the man came back. I was still folding clothes and in the same area, but this time the man actually approached me. He asked me what I was doing after work. I didn't really give him an answer, I just said I don't know. He then asked if I would go with him. I told him no, sorry, and then he grabbed onto my arm. He said we should just leave. This really took me by surprise, and I kind of yelled a little bit. I told him to stop grabbing me. At that point, there were a few people that noticed, and the man let go of me. He then walked away really fast. After that, I told a coworker, but the man was nowhere to be seen, so I thought he would be gone for good. But later on, probably 5 hours later, I saw him again, and he was staring at me. I was sure by now that the man was stalking me or something, and I was kind of concerned he would follow me when I left. I was getting off in about an hour, and I just hoped I wouldn't see the man when I was done. And I didn't, until 10 minutes before I was off when I noticed him. I got a coworker to walk out to my car with me. The man didn't follow me, which was a huge relief, and I drove home. I got home, and thankfully the man didn't follow me. However, that night, I was awoken to a knocking at my front door. I lived with my parents at the time, but I knew it wasn't them or my younger brother because they were all asleep. I laid there confused at first, until I remembered the man who had been stalking me at the store. Then I got a really creepy feeling. I didn't want to get up or even look out the window. Thankfully, I heard the sound of my brother leaving his bedroom. He said out loud he wondered who was knocking on the door at this hour as he walked. It was 2 a.m., and I guess my brother had still been up, most likely playing video games. I heard him get closer to the door, and at that point, I left my room to go over and join him in seeing who was there. As I did, my brother said to me there was nobody there. He then opened the door and stepped out. He looked around and picked up something off the ground, and then came back inside. Once inside, I saw he was holding an envelope. He opened it up and pulled out 2 Polaroid pictures. One of them was of my bedroom window, and the other was of the store that I worked at. When I realized this, I just about had a heart attack. I explained the man to my brother, and I'm 100% sure he's the one who left the envelope. We both woke up my parents, and the police were called. I ended up filling out a report and answering several questions. I got the next few weeks off work, and to my surprise, the next day the man was found at the store once again and caught. On Black Friday of 2016, I went to Walmart to see the deals that they had. There were a number of things that I was interested in getting. Nothing too big like a TV, but a few small things and some Christmas gifts for people. I went there at about midnight, and the store was pretty busy. It was really weird to see a store that crowded at midnight. I looked around, but it was tough to get around the store with it being so crowded. At one point, I was back by the doors to the back room. They had a little window in them, and I randomly was just looking through it to the back rooms. As I did, I noticed someone walking into the back, but they were not a Walmart worker. They wore a ski mask and all black. I thought it had to be some sort of joke or something. There was a worker standing nearby, so I decided to let him know. I told him there was a guy in the back wearing a ski mask. He looked surprised and then asked me to show him where he was. I pointed in the window and he opened the door and asked me where. We both went inside the back room. It got a lot quieter back there as there were finally no crowds. I looked in the direction that the man went, and I explained that he was walking that way. Just as I took a few steps in that direction, I felt someone grab me from behind and cover my eyes with their hand. They seemed to be wearing gloves. Then I felt someone else grab my legs, and next thing I knew, I was being picked up by at least 2 people. They carried me a little ways, and then dropped me into what felt like one of those big garbage cans on wheels. I fell onto a bag of garbage. I looked up and saw 2 men in ski masks. They started pushing me and told me to shut up. I wondered how this was going on with no employees seeing this. I couldn't see much, but I saw that we were passing by an open door leading to outside. I don't know what got into me, but at that moment, I felt there was something I had to do. So I jumped against the side, causing the garbage can that I was in to tip over. I fell out of it and got up and began running. I felt the men right on my heels, and once I made it out the door, I took a left for the front end of the store. We were at the side where there was no people, so I ran as fast as I could, and once I made it back to the front, the men stopped chasing me. I ran straight to my car and drove all the way home. Once there, I called the police. I know I should have called them sooner, but my mind was racing, and I was just desperate to get back home where I felt safe. By the time I called, however, I was told there had been other calls about the men in ski masks at that Walmart. I don't know what those men were up to, but I'm so happy I was able to get away. This was on Black Friday 4 years ago. It was in the middle of all the crowded Black Friday shopping going on. I had gone to Best Buy to look at computers. I was intending on buying a new laptop and possibly a desktop computer as well. They were probably the most popular thing that was going on sale there that day, so I got there a couple of hours early and waited in line. There was quite a few other people waiting, so I brought a chair and some hand warmers and just watched videos and played games on my phone as I waited. I remember there was a guy standing behind me who had short blonde hair, and he was just standing there facing me but not really looking at me the entire time. At one point, I asked him how he was doing, but he didn't answer me. He didn't even look at me at all. The more time went by, it seemed awkward and just really strange as well. At last, finally, the doors to Best Buy were open and all the people rushed inside. I went to the computers and got the laptop I had been planning on getting. I ended up getting the desktop computer as well. I was there for maybe 30 minutes, and then I left and brought the things to my car. I put them in the front passenger seat and then went around and got into the car. But as soon as I sat down and started the engine, I looked in my mirror and saw the man who had been standing behind me in line. He was sitting in the back seat of my car. I freaked out and immediately jumped out of the car and ran all the way back inside to Best Buy. I got out my phone and called the police. Once I regained my composure, I went back out into the parking lot, but my car was gone. I realized I had left the keys in it. The police arrived a short time later. We figured the guy was probably planning to rob me, so I guess he got my stuff. I was just lucky to be okay. But the next day, I got a call saying my car had been found abandoned about 10 miles away, and both of my computers were still inside. This story takes place on one of the best nights for kids around America, but the worst night for me. It was Christmas Eve of 2019. For a little backstory, 3 or 4 months before this event took place, I broke up with my girlfriend. Let's call her Jennifer. The event that caused me to break up with her was she stole over $900 from me. I caught her, and all she said before she left is, "This isn't over." Fast forward 3 months to Christmas Eve. Since we live in Texas and have a house in the hill country, every year on Christmas my family usually goes there to celebrate. However, this year I couldn't make it because I had to work. I was 17 years old and had just got a job at my local supermarket, and I had to work all day of Christmas. I stayed home, but I had no problem with being alone. On Christmas Eve night, it was getting late, probably 11 o'clock or so. I decided to take a shower and go to bed as I needed to get up early the next day. As I started to shower, I heard a strange noise from the garage, sort of like a metallic banging. I thought the noise was coming from the heater because I had put the water as hot as it would go. I took my shower, and when I finished, I went to go get in bed. As I did, I heard the noise again, although this time it was on the other side of the yard. I was confused because I didn't think there was anything over there. I went to go look out the window and see. I looked out and didn't see anything but my backyard, completely empty. I completely disregarded it because my backyard is pretty flat and empty, and it has nowhere for someone to hide. Now it's hard to explain, but my window is fairly large, and it has a blind spot to the left where there's a corner. Somebody could easily hide there, but I was tired and I didn't think about that at all. As I walked off, I heard a bang again, but this time on the window of my house, and as I looked out the window, I saw the figure of a person dressed in all black standing at my window. It made me jump. However, I wasn't too scared as I'm a fairly large dude and a high school football player. This all changed when the person at the window reached for his pocket for what I assume was a gun. I ran away from the window towards my parents' room to go retrieve my dad's shotgun. I knew he kept it in a safe and had the safe key under his pillow. As I was running to retrieve it, I dialed 911. As soon as the dispatcher answered, I heard the horrific sound of glass shattering. I made it to my parents' room and shut the door quietly. I whispered into the phone what was happening to the dispatcher. She said to stay on the line as the county sheriff was en route, but it would take about 5 minutes or so. I told her I was going to retrieve the shotgun. She said that's not a bad idea, but to only use it if I had to, and to use it with caution. I quickly realized my dad took the gun with him to the hill country because they were going to a gun range. I informed the dispatcher that the gun was gone. She said to make sure to stay on the line. For a moment, everything was silent, and I thought that maybe the burglar or whoever was in my house got spooked when they realized someone was home. My heart sank into my chest when I heard not one, but 2 sets of boots walking up the stairs. I heard a heavy metal pole scraping across the floor. I locked and barricaded the door to my parents' room. Then I almost passed out when I heard one of them talk, not in any voice but Jennifer's. She said, "Merry Christmas, Tommy." Then I heard a male voice mockingly say, "We know you're in there." Then they knocked on the door of my parents' room. I almost screamed and got underneath the bed. Jennifer then said, "Don't worry if you don't open the door. We'll open it for you." I heard the pole hit the door and the lock started jiggling. I had to put my hand over my mouth to keep from being too loud. Then, all of a sudden, I heard police sirens and Jennifer muttering curse words. They ran down the stairs to try to leave out the front door when I heard someone yell, "Freeze." I heard a bunch of yelling, and then an officer come in and announce himself and tell anybody in the house to make themselves known. I called out to him saying that I was Tommy and I dialed 911. He told me to come out slowly with my hands visible. As I left my parents' room, I saw the 2 being escorted out in handcuffs. The rest of my night consisted of paperwork and me talking to my parents, who were making a 3-hour drive to come home and be with me. This incident was very disturbing to me, and I'm grateful that I reacted the way that I did. Had I not, I may not be here right now. Christmas, everyone's favorite time of the year. It was certainly my favorite time of the year until one night that changed everything. and that one night changed my life forever. The Christmas of 2018, I was sitting in my living room, watching the snow get heavier and heavier. I was enjoying myself drinking a cup of hot cocoa until I heard a knock at my door. I thought, who could it be at this hour? It was 1:18 in the morning. I got up to open the door, and to my surprise, I saw nobody. I closed the door, thinking I was being ding-dong ditched, or it was all in my head. 5 minutes later, another knock on my door. I once again got up to open the door, and when I saw nobody, I sighed and shut it. Almost immediately after, another knock on my door, and this time, I was quick enough to swing the door open, and I could just get a glimpse of a kid. He looked to be about 5 or 6 years old, running towards a house that was adjacent to mine. Surprisingly, I never knew who lived there, and quite frankly, I never seemed to care. However, this time I wanted to know why such a little kid was roaming out in the middle of the night, so I planned to go over there the next morning. Morning finally came, and I headed towards the house where I was sure I saw the little boy run into. When I knocked on the door, nobody answered. I figured they weren't home and I would come back later. That evening, I tried going back to the house and once again knocked. There was no answer again. I thought to myself this was quite strange. I then tried the door angle, and to my surprise, the door wasn't locked. Curiosity got the better of me, and I unlawfully entered the house knowing I was breaking and entering. As soon as I entered the house, I smelled something foul in the air, the smell of rotting meat. The inside of this house looked like nobody had lived there for years. I decided to check the upstairs of this house, and once I climbed up the stairs to the top step, I saw there were 5 bedrooms adjacent to each other. I checked out the one to my right, which was nothing special, just a bed and a closet. I checked out the rest of the bedrooms and found nothing. Great, I thought to myself, this was a complete waste of my time. Just as I was about to leave though, I felt a tap on my shoulder. It startled me. I knew I was caught red-handed, but just as I could say anything, I saw it was a woman, and she put her hand over my mouth and shushed me. I slowly backed away and then sprinted back to my house. As I did, I heard the blood-curdling scream of the woman telling me to come back. I got back to my house and decided not to do anything. At 3 a.m., I woke up to sounds outside my window. I looked out and saw the same woman staring back at me with a wide smile that ran across her face. Her crazed eyes stared back at me on the other side of the glass. I fell back in shock and then dialed 911. Cops were at my location within minutes. I had told them what happened, and they went to the house across the street. They searched it and found nothing. They told me there were no signs of anyone there since the horrifying murder that had took place in that very house. I was shocked. I hadn't heard of anything happening at all in that house, as it was an ongoing investigation. The cops were not able to give me the information I so desperately wanted to know. The next day, I did some research, and what I found made me sick. On December 31st, a mother and her son were brutally murdered inside that very house. December 31st, I linked everything together and stared at myself in the mirror in pure horror. The events that took place to this day have changed me forever. In the next 8 months, I quit my job and had to get therapy for the rest of the year. I would wake up at late hours of the night to see the woman's crazed smiles staring back at me, and I would scream in pure horror. It's been a year since this traumatizing experience, and I'm still recovering. This happened many years ago when I was a little boy. It was Christmas time, and my family and I lived on the first floor of a large apartment complex. I remember one day on a Saturday, my mom told me that Santa was at our apartment. We went to the event room that our apartment had, and they were doing a Meet Santa type of thing. There wasn't a whole lot of people there, but those who lived nearby and had kids would bring them to see Santa. We went there and got in line, and then my sister and I met Santa. I remember when it was my turn, he asked me what I wanted for Christmas, and I told him I wanted the new PlayStation. He asked me if I live here, and I told him yes, I lived right down the hall. He then told me he would see what he could do about getting me that PlayStation and gave me a candy cane. We then went back home. I think we made some holiday cookies or something. I don't quite remember that well, but where the story really gets interesting is later that night. I was in my bed and not really that sleepy, so I was just laying there playing on my Game Boy. I was in the middle of a level in my game when I heard a noise come from my window, which was literally right next to my bed. I looked up through the blinds, which were open so that you could see through them. I saw Santa standing right outside my window, and it really shocked me. He motioned for me to open the window, and I did. He then smiled at me and asked if I remembered him. I told him yes, and he handed me another candy cane. He told me he wanted to show me his sleigh. I knew something felt off about this situation. I didn't really think Santa was supposed to show up at my window like this, because it wasn't Christmas Eve yet, it was like a week before. But he was Santa after all, so I told him I'd like to see it. He told me to come out the window, and so I opened it wider. As I was about to climb out the window, the door to my room opened. It was my mother, and when she saw what was going on, she ran to me and grabbed me. When she did, Santa turned and ran away into the night. She asked me what was going on, and when I explained it to her, she told me that the man at my window was not really Santa, but just an impostor pretending to be him. She then called the police, but by the time they got there, the man was long gone. I was young, but when I spoke to my mom about the incident in recent years, she told me based on the information of the man dressed as Santa who was at the apartment that day, they were able to locate the man and he was caught. I'm so glad that my mom came into my room when she did.
I've worked as a mall Santa for the past few Christmases now. I'm only 33, but thanks to my complete lack of exercise routine, I definitely have the figure for it. And once I have the beard and the wig and hat combo going, there's basically no telling the difference between me and a 60-year-old dude. Mall Santa work can be tough for a few different reasons. Number one, the hours are really long and the pay can be really terrible depending on which mall you manage to get employed by. Number two, the kids can be little monsters, and their parents can be just as terrible on occasion too. But the reason I'm actually considering skipping the entire thing this year and having something of a budget Christmas is that you get some seriously disturbing things happening from time to time. I mean, the kind of things that keep you up at night, even after a long, exhausting shift. However, the worst thing that's ever happened to me as a mall Santa was actually nothing to do with kids, parents, or terrible pay and hours, and I'm sure you'll see why after I tell the story. So every year, usually when the malls are quietest during weekday mornings, we get specially organized visits from special needs kids or adults with learning disabilities who are bussed in from the surrounding areas. Pretty much every other mall Santa I've spoken to about this agrees that it can be one of the most rewarding parts of the job, and that the adults with learning difficulties are often even more excited about the prospect of meeting Santa than some of the kids are. Literally, the only downside is that some of them are so heavy that my thighs hurt after having like 50 in a row sit on my lap, but other than that, it's honestly one of the best parts of the job. Last year, I'm in the middle of one of the special sessions when I get this girl coming up and sitting on my lap. I say girl, but she was legitimately a grown woman, looking like she was in her mid-30s or something, but she had the mental age of about 9 or 10, all smiles and giggles, way shy about meeting Santa again. It was cute as all get out, but the interaction was not so cute, and turned that way pretty fast. So like I said, she's all giggles and smiles as she comes up to sit on my lap, and I give her the usual spiel, asking her name, how old she is, if she's excited for Christmas and all that stuff. Then, when it comes to asking her what she wants me to bring her on Christmas Eve, she starts thinking about it, smiling at first before she suddenly gets super serious with a touch of sadness. I'm asking her if she's okay, what the problem is, and she's like shaking her head, acting like she doesn't want to tell me anything. I take the time and explaining that no matter what she asks for, I'll try my very, very best to bring it to her, no matter how big or small it is, that Santa always tries his best to bring good little girls and boys what they ask for on Christmas. She takes a moment, then the exchange goes a little something like this. You mean it, Santa? You can get me anything I want for Christmas? Anything. Anything you want. Just tell me and I'll do my best. Okay, well... And at this point she lowers her voice to a whisper and leans into my ear. I want my boyfriend to stop hitting me. Can you make that happen? I was sort of dumbstruck for a second. Like all of the things I thought she was going to ask, that would most definitely not have topped the list. I remember just nodding at first, trying to find the words, then being like, I'll make that happen for you, sure, no problem. She was so happy to hear that I'd fix it for her, and gave me the biggest hug I think I'd ever received while working as a mall Santa. I had to put on a huge smile, and of all the times I've had to fake being jolly and merry, that time with her was the hardest. But I just felt numb, like completely broken by what I'd heard, and I just tried my best to get through the rest of the session without bursting into tears. I remember all these thoughts rushing through my head, terrifying ideas of institutional abuse. She said boyfriend, and that made it extra creepy. Like, sure, it could have been just another guy in her care group or something, another adult with learning difficulties who she'd hooked up with somehow, but there was nothing to say that it wasn't a member of her care team that was, like, abusing her, in a completely different sense, too. Not just physically, but, well, you catch my drift. So when the session was over, I approached the member of the care team that had organized the trip and had accompanied them to the mall. I didn't let anything slip. I just told them how great I thought the session had gone and asked a few details about the group that had organized them. As it turned out, they were all from the same care home type thing, so I made a note of the name of the place as well as the name of the girl that was apparently being abused. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just kept picturing some evil monster abusing that poor girl, taking advantage of their position to put some poor special needs woman through torture, then telling her that she'd be killed if she ever breathed a word of it to anyone. And here's where stuff starts getting even more intense. Now, I could have just called 911 with the info I had at hand, registered a general complaint, and then heard nothing back about it. But a buddy of mine had a cousin with the local police department, and not just some gumshoe beat cop either. They were a detective. It took some convincing, but I convinced my buddy to pass along their cell phone numbers so I could get in touch with the dude personally. It took a little while, but I managed to get through to the guy. He sounded pretty skeptical at first and seemed kind of irritated that his cousin had even given me his number, but once I explained what the issue was, his tone changed completely. Now, I didn't find this out until way later from my friend, but his cousin had a special needs daughter who was probably going to have to either live with them for the rest of their life or was going to head into a group home at some point so she could have some measure of independence. So when I explained the situation with the special needs girl I met as a mall Santa, it obviously hit the guy right in the feels as the topic was so close to home. The detective tells me that he'll look into it, thanks me for letting him know. I get him to promise to tell me if anything comes of it, and he says yes, and we hang up. And that was the last I heard of it for like a month. Then after maybe 5 or 6 weeks, I'd almost forgotten about the whole thing. Christmas was over, the mall Santa job was way behind me, and I was back to working my regular hours as a self-employed mechanic. Then I get a call from a number that seems vaguely familiar, although I wasn't quite sure why. Turns out it was my buddy's detective cousin, who reminded me of the tip that I'd given him about the care company. Of course I remembered, but by that time I really didn't think anything would come of it, but oh, how wrong I was. The detective thanks me for the information, and although he told me he couldn't say too much, he told me to keep an eye out on local media outlets. The next thing I know, it's all over the local papers that there's been a misconduct scandal involving a local care company. I picked up a copy and read the story, only to find out that
it's the very same one I had reported. The long and short of it is that the cops had uncovered endemic levels of abuse in the company, stuff that varied from financial discrepancies to straight-up physical abuse, and sickeningly enough, there was even cases of care workers taking advantage of mentally disabled females in ways that were seriously inappropriate. There were numerous arrests, with some of the sleazier and violent criminals looking like they were going to get years in prison for how long they so cruelly taken advantage of some of the most vulnerable people in society. It made me sick to my stomach to read about how some people could bring themselves to do something like that, but it was stopped, and I felt incredible that I'd actually managed to be a part of the chain of events that brought the whole thing crashing down. I just hoped that that poor girl, who was obviously pretty traumatized by what was happening to her, and just not being able to understand why it was happening either, found some measure of peace after it. And in a way, Santa did kind of bring her exactly what she wanted, even if it wasn't on Christmas Day, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is a thought that never fails to make me tear up.